Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets comfortable, the ancient world slows down, and science takes the quiet path through the dust. Tonight, we're going to a place that no longer waits for us in the open air. It is not a great stone pyramid standing above the desert, not a palace with carved walls, not a city with gates, streets, markets, and kings. It is older than all of that. Much older. We're going to a settlement beside the Euphrates River in what is now northern Syria, a place called Jerf el Ahmar, where people were gathering, building, eating, working, storing, remembering, and perhaps changing the future of human life around 11,000 years ago. Archaeologists place the site in the early Neolithic, often dated around 9,500 to 8,700 BC, and its excavations revealed ordinary houses as well as large communal buildings, grain storage, and signs of intensive cereal use before fully domesticated farming had taken over. Now that might sound like a simple statement at first. People gathered by a river, people made buildings, people handled grain. Fair enough. Humans have always been very good at finding somewhere useful, putting things down, and then wondering where they left them. But Jerf el Ahmar matters because of when this was happening. This was before pottery was common in the region, before cities, before writing, before kings wrote their names on monuments and expected everyone to be impressed, before fields of wheat stretched across the landscape in the familiar farming world we imagine today. These were people living at a turning point, close enough to the world of mobile hunter-gatherers that the older ways had not vanished, yet close enough to the coming world of villages and agriculture that something new was clearly taking shape. They were not simply wandering through the land and leaving faint traces behind. They were returning. They were staying. They were building places that took planning. They were creating spaces larger than one household needed. And that simple fact opens a very large question. Why here? Why this place? Why were humans gathering here 11,000 years ago? Before we walk into that question gently and carefully, I'd love to ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? And what sort of place are you in right now? Are you near a river, a city street, a quiet field, a room full of books, or perhaps somewhere where the day has already grown soft at the edges? It is a strange little comfort to think about, isn't it? You are there, in your own small corner of the present, and we are about to spend time with people who lived so long ago that even their oldest memories have turned to soil, and yet they too had places. They had favourite routes, familiar smells, work to finish, food to prepare, children making noise at exactly the wrong moment, and probably at least one person who thought the storage area would be much more organised if everyone simply listened to them for once. If this kind of quiet journey into deep human history helps you relax, think, or simply drift away from the busyness of the day, I'd be very grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, or shared this little resting place with someone who enjoys old mysteries told slowly. It helps the channel reach others who might want something calm, thoughtful, and gently curious before sleep. And as always, I do hope this is interesting enough to keep you company, but not so interesting that it keeps you wide awake. That is always the delicate balance here. We want the mind to wander, but not sprint. We want the past to open like a door, but not slam dramatically against the wall. So let's begin at the edge of the Euphrates, not as tourists, not as experts with clipboards, but as quiet observers arriving very early in the long human story. Imagine the land before the village was a ruin, before the site was excavated, before it was flooded after the construction of the Tishrin Dam, which ended the fieldwork there in the late 1990s. Imagine the river moving through a landscape that would have looked different from the one we know today. There would have been seasonal changes, dry stretches, patches of vegetation, wild grasses, animals moving through, and people who understood these patterns with a kind of practical attention that most of us have lost. Not because they were simple, and certainly not because they were waiting around for civilization to arrive, but because their lives depended on noticing. The exact time when plants ripened, the places where animals passed, the slopes that held warmth, the safe approaches to water, the good stone, the bad weather coming from a certain direction, the memory of where food had been found last year, and whether last year could be trusted to repeat itself. That is one of the first things Jerf el Ahmar asks us to understand. The people who gathered there were not primitive figures standing at the beginning of a straight road toward modern life. They were skilled, observant, socially complex human beings living in a world that demanded intelligence every day. They knew things we would not know. Many of us can barely identify 3 plants outside a supermarket without becoming suspicious of all of them. These people knew landscapes in detail. They knew how to move through them, how to use them, and increasingly, perhaps, how to settle into them for longer periods. The question is not when did humans suddenly become clever. Humans were already clever. The question is what changed in the relationship between people, place, food, and memory that made a settlement like Jerf el Ahmar possible. For a long time, the story of the Neolithic was often told rather neatly. First, people wandered. Then someone invented farming, possibly after looking at a seed and having a very productive afternoon. Then villages appeared. Then came pottery, towns, cities, and eventually all the usual human complications, including paperwork, property disputes, and people complaining about the younger generation. But archaeology has a habit of making tidy stories less tidy, which is one of its better qualities. Sites like Jerf el Ahmar show that the change from foraging to farming was not a single moment and not a simple switch. It was a long, uneven process full of experiments, habits, returns, adjustments, and probably arguments around the fire about whether this new way of doing things was worth all the effort. At Jerf el Ahmar, the evidence points to people making serious use of wild cereals. Not modern fields in the later farming sense, not neat rows of wheat stretching to the horizon, but a world where wild barley, rye, einkorn and other plants were gathered, processed, stored, and perhaps encouraged in ways that were beginning to alter human life. Archaeobotanical research from the site has been especially important because it shows large-scale cereal processing before full domestication, meaning people were investing labour in grain long before the familiar agricultural package was complete. This is not a small detail. Grain is not the easiest food in the world. You do not pluck it from the plant and enjoy it like a berry. It has to be harvested, carried, dried, stored, protected, ground, cooked, shared, and guarded from damp, pests, and that one relative who keeps taking more than their fair portion. Grain rewards planning. Grain invites storage. Storage invites staying. Staying invites buildings. Buildings invite neighbours. Neighbours invite cooperation, tension, rules, rituals, and someone eventually saying, perhaps with great seriousness, that the meeting space really needs to be bigger. And that brings us to one of the most interesting things about Jerf el Ahmar. The site was not only a cluster of domestic structures. Excavations revealed special communal buildings, including large round or subterranean structures with benches and internal features, which suggest that people were creating places for gatherings that went beyond the needs of a single family. This is where the question becomes warmer and stranger. A settlement is not just a place where people sleep. It is a place where people agree, somehow, to keep coming back. A communal building is not just architecture. It is a sign that a group has reasons to meet. Maybe to store food, maybe to prepare it, maybe to perform rituals, maybe to make decisions, maybe to remember the dead. Maybe to handle tensions that naturally arise when several households live close enough to hear each other's problems through the wall, assuming the wall is doing its best but cannot perform miracles. We should be careful, of course. Archaeology does not give us a transcript. No one at Jerf el Ahmar left a note saying, "Dear future viewers, this building is mainly for seasonal ceremonies, collective grain storage, and occasional complaints about grinding stones. We have floors, post holes, benches, tools, charred seeds, human remains, animal bones, and the shapes of buildings. From these, archaeologists build careful interpretations, always with some uncertainty. But uncertainty is not failure. It is part of the work. The past rarely speaks in complete sentences. More often, it leaves us a pattern and asks us not to rush. Jerf el Ahmar sat along a river system that mattered. The Euphrates was not just a source of water, although water alone would have been reason enough to pay attention. Rivers gather life. Plants grow more reliably near them. Animals visit them. People travel along them. Ideas move with them. Materials move with them. Stories move with them. If you are trying to understand why people repeatedly came to a place, start with the water, but do not stop there. A river is not only a resource, it is a route. It is a boundary. It is a meeting line. It is a place where people can find fish, reeds, animals, plant foods, mud for building, and a reliable reference point in a wide landscape. If the land is a book, a river is one of the sentences people can follow. But the people of Jerf el Ahmar were not only choosing a convenient campsite, they were investing in a location. That is the real difference. Anyone can stop near water for a night. Building a settlement means something else. It means cutting, carrying, shaping, digging, arranging, repairing and returning. It means the place has become part of the group's future. It also means the group has begun to imagine time differently. Not in the philosophical sense, where someone sits dramatically under the stars and invents a theory of existence. More practically. If you build a storage space, you're thinking about next month. If you prepare grain in quantity, you're thinking about the season ahead. If you build a communal structure, you are thinking about gatherings that have not happened yet. The future becomes something you make room for. That is a quiet but enormous change. Mobile hunter-gatherer life also involves planning, of course. It would be very wrong to imagine movement as randomness. Seasonal mobility can be extremely organised, built around routes, cycles, and deep ecological knowledge. But more permanent or repeatedly occupied settlements create different pressures. Food can be gathered and stored in one place. Tools can accumulate. Buildings can be repaired instead of abandoned. Children can grow up knowing the same walls. Burials can connect the living to a specific patch of ground. And once memory is tied to place, place becomes more than useful. It becomes meaningful. This may be one answer to why humans were gathering at Jerf el Ahmar. Not the only answer, but an important one. They gathered because the environment offered opportunities. They gathered because wild cereals and other resources could support repeated occupation. They gathered because the river connected them to movement and life. They gathered because group living allowed cooperation in tasks too large or too useful for one household alone. And perhaps gradually they gathered because the place itself had become part of who they were. There is a tendency, when we look back this far, to make ancient people either too simple or too grand. We imagine them as helpless creatures surviving day to day, or we turn every structure into a temple and every mark into a cosmic symbol. Jerf el Ahmar asks for something more balanced. These were people with ordinary needs and extraordinary historical importance. They needed food, shelter, warmth, tools, safety, and community. They also lived at a moment when those needs were being answered in new ways. They were not building skyscrapers. They were not writing laws. They were not making pottery in the later familiar sense. But they were doing something that may be just as important. They were learning how to live together in one place with enough consistency that architecture, storage, ritual, and daily routine began to hold one another in place. Picture the settlement not as silent ruins, but as a working environment. There is dust underfoot. There are people moving between houses. Someone is grinding grain with the heavy patience that grinding requires. Someone else is carrying plant material. Children are nearby because children are always nearby in human life, especially when you're trying to finish something. Smoke rises, tools are sharpened, food is sorted. A dog may be watching with deep interest, though whether it is helping is another matter. People talk, they exchange news, warnings, jokes, complaints, small plans, larger worries. The river continues in the background, not as scenery, but as part of the settlement's daily rhythm. And somewhere within this lived place, people enter a larger building. It is not a home in the ordinary sense. It has been made differently. Its size, shape, benches and placement suggest a role shared by the group. We cannot say exactly what happened inside every time people gathered there, but the very existence of such a structure tells us that collective life had become important enough to build for. This is one of the deep clues of Jerf el Ahmar. When people build for gathering, gathering itself has become a force. That is why the question in our title is not just about location. It is not only asking why humans came to this spot beside the Euphrates. It is asking why gathering had begun to matter in a new way. Why a group would return often enough to leave thick layers of occupation. Why they would build shared spaces. Why grain would become so central. Why storage, labour and ritual seem to appear together, not as separate inventions, but as parts of one changing way of life. The answer will not be a single discovery, because human history rarely works like that. It will be a combination of climate, landscape, food, social bonds, memory, risk, cooperation, and habit. In other words, the usual human mixture. Practical needs, clever solutions, and emotions quietly doing more work than anyone admits. We are starting, then, with a place that sits at the edge of several worlds. It belongs to the pre-pottery Neolithic A period before many of the things people usually associate with settled farming life had become widespread. It belongs to the northern Levant and upper Euphrates region, where several early sites began revealing levels of social and architectural complexity that made archaeologists rethink older assumptions about how the Neolithic began. It belongs to a time after the last ice age, when environments were changing and human groups were responding in creative ways, and it belongs to a story that has become harder to see directly, because the site itself is now underwater. That detail gives the place a slightly unusual feeling. Jerf el Ahmar was rescued by archaeology just before it disappeared beneath the reservoir. A village from the beginning of settled life, briefly opened, carefully recorded, and then covered again. There is something very human in that, though we do not need to make it grand. The site was occupied, abandoned, buried, discovered, excavated, and submerged. It has passed through many kinds of silence, yet the evidence remains strong enough to ask questions. What brought people here? What held them here? What were they doing together that could not be done in the same old ways? And what did they begin, perhaps without knowing it, that would eventually lead toward farming villages, larger communities, and the long, complicated road to the world outside your window? For tonight, we will not rush to answer all of that at once. A place like Jerf el Ahmar deserves a slower approach. It is not a puzzle box to be snapped open, but a settlement to walk through carefully, noticing how each piece fits into the next. The river first, then the houses, then the communal buildings, then the grain, then the food practices, the storage, the rituals, the symbols, the dead, and the wider human shift from movement towards settlement. Each clue is modest on its own, but together they begin to show why people may have gathered here with such persistence. So settle in, loosen the day a little, and imagine the Euphrates moving through the early morning. Not the Euphrates of maps and borders, not the river as a political line or a name in a history book, but the river as it would have been to people who lived by its moods. A source of water, yes, but also a path, a signal, a risk, a promise, and probably on some days, a nuisance. Rivers flood, mud sticks, insects arrive uninvited. Life beside water is generous, but it is rarely tidy. Still, people came, they built, they returned, they gathered at the Red Cliff, at Jerf el Ahmar, in a world before cities, before writing, before most of the things we use to define civilization. And from that gathering we can begin to follow the first steady thread into the deeper story of why this place mattered. Long before there were cities along the Euphrates, long before walls, temples, writing, taxes, officials, and all the other things humans eventually invented to make life both impressive and mildly inconvenient, there was the river itself. It moved through the land whether anyone was there to name it or not. It rose and fell with the seasons. It carried silt, moisture, reeds, fish, birds, animals, and paths of movement. To us, looking back from a world of maps and borders, the Euphrates is a named river, a blue line on a page, a feature in the long story of Mesopotamia. But to the people gathering near Jerf el Ahmar around 11,000 years ago, it was not a line on anything. It was part of daily life. It was where the land changed. It was where plants grew differently. It was where animals came to drink. It was where people could orient themselves, return, meet others, and make plans that stretched a little farther than one night's shelter. Jerf el Ahmar was placed on the bank of the Middle Euphrates in northern Syria, in a landscape that was not chosen by accident. Archaeological descriptions place the site on two hills separated by a small gully, close to the river and occupied during the pre-pottery Neolithic A, roughly the period when settled life was beginning to take new forms in this region. That setting matters because in the early Neolithic, a good location was not simply pleasant. It was survival, memory, work, and opportunity all folded together. A riverbank could offer water, but it could also offer far more than that. It could offer a predictable point in a world where predictability was valuable. If you know where the river is, you know where certain plants are likely to be. You know where animals may pass. You know where mud, reeds, stones, fish, birds, and shade may be found. You know where other people might appear too, because rivers do not only gather plants and animals. They gather humans with all their tools, stories, needs, and opinions about how things should be done. It is tempting to imagine the people of Jerf el Ahmar arriving as if they were looking for the perfect real estate listing. Good river view, seasonal resources nearby, reasonable access to wild cereals, plenty of room for communal buildings, slight issue with future flooding by a dam, but that part would come much later. Of course, that is not how choices worked. There was no single moment when someone stood on a slope pointed toward the Euphrates and announced that this would be the start of a very important archaeological site. More likely, the relationship between people and place developed through repeated use. A group came, they found food, they returned, they learned the patterns, they adjusted their routines, they built something small, then something more lasting. The place became familiar, familiarity became habit, habit became attachment. And slowly the riverbank stopped being only a useful stop and began to be a place that held people. To understand why that could happen, it helps to think about what a river does in a dry or semi-dry landscape. It creates variety. Away from water, the land may offer one set of plants and animals. Near water, there is another. Edges are often rich places in ecology. The edge between dry ground and wet ground, between open land and vegetation, between slope and floodplain, between movement and rest. Humans have always paid attention to edges, because edges often mean options. A river edge can give fish and freshwater animals. It can bring birds. It can support grasses and reeds. It can attract gazelles or other animals coming to drink. It can create soft ground where plants grow strongly after floods. And when you are living without supermarkets, refrigeration, delivery services, or a cupboard full of emergency biscuits, options matter very much. The Euphrates also gave people a path. Before roads, rivers were among the easiest ways to understand movement across large landscapes. You could follow them. You could cross them at certain points. You could remember bends, cliffs, islands, terraces, gullies, and stands of vegetation. A river makes geography readable. It gives the mind a route to hold on to. For people moving seasonally or exchanging materials and news with other groups, that mattered. You did not need a map if you had a remembered landscape. The hill, the bend, the red cliff, the place where the water ran shallow, the patch of plants that came back each year. This kind of knowledge was not casual. It was a living archive carried in the body and in speech, passed between adults and children, repeated by walking. Jerf el Ahmar's name is often translated as the Red Cliff, and even that small detail gives us a way to picture the place more concretely. Not as a vague dot in prehistory, but as somewhere with a distinctive appearance. A cliff, a bank, a slope, a relationship to the water. When people name places, or when later names preserve visible features, it reminds us that landscapes are not generic. They have personalities in the practical sense. One bank is safe, another is steep. One bend catches debris after floods, another is good for crossing. One slope warms early in the day, another holds shade. When you live closely with land, these details are not background. They are part of the structure of life. The people gathering at Jerf el Ahmar lived at a time when climate and environment had already shifted after the end of the last ice age. The world was not fixed, and human groups across Southwest Asia were adapting to new patterns of plants, animals, and seasons. The old image of hunter-gatherers simply wandering until farming appeared is much too simple. Many groups were already managing their landscapes in thoughtful ways. They harvested wild cereals in quantity, returned to productive stands, stored food, and built more substantial dwellings. At Jerf el Ahmar, archaeologists found strong evidence for large-scale cereal processing before full domestication, including rows of querns in buildings and the systematic use of wild barley and other cereals. The river did not create this change by itself, of course. Rivers do not whisper instructions about agriculture, despite what some very determined documentaries might imply, but the river created a setting where repeated gathering, processing, storing and returning could become increasingly practical. Think for a moment about wild grain. It is small, seasonal and labour-intensive. Harvesting it requires timing. Too early, and the grain is not ready. Too late, and much of it may fall or be taken by birds, insects, animals or other people who had the same excellent idea. Once gathered, it must be processed. Husks, stems, seeds, dust and grit all have to be dealt with. Grinding is slow work. Storage requires dry, protected spaces. The whole process rewards cooperation and planning. If a group knows that productive cereal stands grow within reach of a familiar river settlement, then returning to that place makes sense. Not only because food is there, but because the tools, buildings and social arrangements needed to process food can stay there too. This is one of the quiet engines behind settled life. Heavy things encourage staying. A hunter's toolkit can be carried, a basket can be carried, a child can be carried, though not always without complaint from either party. But grinding stones are different. Querns and large stone tools are not the sort of thing you casually pack up after breakfast. When people invest in heavy equipment, fixed storage, and buildings, they are changing their relationship to movement. They may still hunt, they may still gather. They may still move seasonally in some ways, but the settlement becomes a centre of gravity. It pulls activity back toward itself. The river helps hold that centre because it makes the place productive and recognisable year after year. Water also shapes social life in ways that are easy to miss. A river is not private. It is shared by necessity. People may control access to certain spots, but the river itself connects households and groups. Tasks near water are visible. People see each other coming and going. They exchange information. They notice who is carrying what. They help, compete, cooperate, complain, and remember. If you want to understand early gathering places, it is useful to imagine not just resources but encounters. The riverbank is where you might meet relatives from another group, potential partners, visitors, rivals, or people bringing materials from elsewhere. A settlement near a river can become a social crossroads without ever becoming a town. There is evidence from Jerf el Ahmar that materials such as obsidian move through wider networks. A study of obsidian from the site examined its provenance and placed the settlement within broader exchange or movement connections during the 10th millennium BC. Obsidian does not naturally appear everywhere. It comes from particular volcanic sources, so when it appears at a site like Jerf el Ahmar, it suggests links beyond the immediate village. That does not mean there were merchants in the later sense strolling along the Euphrates with price lists and a firm policy on refunds. It means that people, objects, and relationships were moving. Materials passed from hand to hand, group to group, place to place. The river may have helped guide those movements, not as a highway in the modern sense, but as a natural corridor through the landscape. A river can also reduce risk, not eliminate it, of course. Rivers flood, dry, shift, erode, and sometimes behave like they have not read the settlement plan. But in general, living near a river can diversify what people rely on. If one food source fails, another may be available. If hunting is poor, plant resources may help. If dry uplands are difficult, the river valley may still offer something. For people experimenting with longer stays and heavier investment in place, this mattered. Settled life can be productive, but it can also be risky. When you stay put, you cannot simply walk away from every local shortage. You need a landscape that can support repeated occupation. Jerf el Ahmar's river setting would have helped make that possible. Still, we should not imagine that the Euphrates alone explains everything. Human gathering is never only about water and food. If it were, every useful riverbank would become a major settlement, and history would be much easier to predict, though perhaps less interesting. People gather where resources, memory, safety, habit, and social meaning overlap. Jerf el Ahmar became important because the river made life possible there, but the people made the place durable. They built houses, they created communal buildings, they processed food on a scale that suggests organised routines. They returned often enough for the settlement to accumulate layers of life. Excavations at Jerf el Ahmar revealed domestic architecture, along with special communal structures, a pattern that pushed archaeologists to rethink early Neolithic social complexity. That is where the river's role becomes part of a larger story. It gathered people to the place, but once people were there, they gathered each other. Imagine an early morning beside the river. The air is cool, the settlement is beginning to move. Someone steps out from a house and looks toward the water, not with wonder in the dramatic sense, but with the normal attention of someone checking what the day might allow. Is the river high? Has the mud shifted? Are birds moving along the bank? Are there tracks? Is the path safe? Nearby, others are preparing tools. Someone is carrying grain or plant material. Someone is annoyed because a tool is not where it was left. This is one of the oldest forms of human irritation and may be considered a cultural universal. Children move between adults. Smoke rises from hearths. A group heads out, perhaps toward stands of wild cereals, perhaps toward hunting grounds, perhaps toward the river itself. The day is not romantic to the people living it. It is work. It is routine. It is weather, hunger, skill, memory, and timing. But from far away in time, we can see something they could not. We can see that these routines were part of a major shift. The repeated gathering at places like Jerf el Ahmar helped create conditions for later farming communities. Not because these people woke up and decided to invent the Neolithic, which would have been a rather ambitious morning, but because daily decisions accumulated. Harvesting more grain, returning more often, building stronger houses, making shared structures, storing food, relying more heavily on certain plants, organising labour around processing. Each decision may have been practical, ordinary, even boring in the moment. Together they changed human history. This is why the Euphrates should not be treated merely as scenery. It was part of the mechanism that made these decisions sensible. It anchored the settlement in a productive zone. It offered routes and resources. It gave the community a reason to return and a way to connect. In a time before cities, the river did some of the work that streets and marketplaces would do later. It brought movement past the settlement. It concentrated life along its banks. It made encounters more likely. It gave people a shared reference point. If someone said, in whatever language they spoke, that a gathering would happen near the red cliff by the river, people could understand where that meant. A place becomes powerful when it can be found again. The river also created a rhythm. Not a soft, mystical rhythm, but a practical one. Seasons changed what could be done. Water levels changed where people could walk or gather. Plants ripened at certain times. Animals moved according to water, food, and temperature. These patterns structured human activity. Modern schedules are often built around clocks. At Jerf el Ahmar, schedules would have been built around environmental timing. When the plants are ready, you harvest. When animals move, you hunt. When weather threatens, you prepare. When food is abundant, you process and store. When people gather, you meet, share, decide, and perhaps mark events in ways we can only partly understand. A settlement in such a place was not isolated from the wild landscape. It was woven into it. Houses did not mean nature had been left outside. The village was a tool for living within the environment, not apart from it. The riverbank, the uplands, the plant stands, the animal paths, the stone sources, and the settlement formed a working system. People moved through that system with knowledge learned over generations. They did not need domesticated wheat fields to be sophisticated. Their sophistication was in timing, cooperation, observation, and adjustment. At the same time, living together near the river would have brought new problems. More people in one place means more coordination. Food must be shared or protected. Storage must be managed. Space must be negotiated. Waste must go somewhere, preferably not where everyone is about to sit. Tasks must be organized. If grain processing grows, someone has to do the grinding, the carrying, the cleaning, the storage, and the cooking. If buildings are larger or more elaborate, people must cooperate to build and maintain them. The river made gathering possible, but gathering required social solutions. Jerf el Ahmar is interesting because it shows both sides. The environmental pull of a good place and the human work needed to turn that place into a community. That community did not yet resemble a city. There were no streets full of shops, no administrative tablets, no palace officials quietly making life complicated. But the seeds of later social life were there in a modest and very important form. A group living near a reliable river, using wild cereals intensively, building special communal spaces, and investing in one place across time. These are not small things. They are the roots of a new kind of human world. Not a sudden revolution, but a slow tightening of the bond between people and place. The river that gathered people before cities existed did not gather them by force. It offered reasons. Water is one reason. Food is another. Movement is another. Safety, memory, and meeting are others. Over time, reasons can become routines, and routines can become traditions. A useful riverbank can become a known settlement. A known settlement can become a place where people expect to gather, and once expectation enters the picture, a place has become more than useful. It has become part of social life. Jerf el Ahmar now lies beneath the waters created by the Tishrin Dam Reservoir, after rescue excavations ended in 1999. That modern ending adds a strange layer to the story. A settlement once drawn to the river was eventually covered by water. The same broad river system that helped explain its ancient life also shaped its modern disappearance from view. But archaeology recorded enough before the flooding to let us sit beside that old bank in thought. We can picture the settlement not as a lost city, because it was never a city, but as something earlier and perhaps more revealing, a community learning how to stay. And as we stay with it for a little longer, the river begins to lead us inward. From the bank to the houses, from the water to the paths between buildings, from the landscape that drew people into the settlement they made once they were there. The question slowly changes. It is no longer only why this riverbank was attractive. It becomes what kind of life began to form beside it. What sort of village existed before villages were supposed to matter so much, and how ordinary walls, floors, hearths, and working spaces can show us a world quietly becoming more settled. A village is one of those things that can sound very simple until you try to define it. A few houses near each other, a place where people sleep, cook, work, and complain about the weather together. A settlement small enough that everyone probably knows who borrowed the tool and did not return it, but large enough that people begin needing rules, habits, shared spaces, and a little patience. In our everyday imagination, a village belongs to the world after farming. We picture fields nearby, animals penned somewhere inconvenient, stored grain, clay pots, paths between houses, and people who have clearly decided, for better or worse, that this is where they live. But Jerf el Ahmar asks us to move that picture backward into a time when the usual pieces of village life had not fully arrived. There were no cities yet. Pottery was not part of daily life in the familiar later way. Farming, in the full domesticated sense, was still emerging. And yet, beside the Euphrates, people had built something that was not merely a campsite. It was a settlement with domestic buildings, communal structures, repeated occupations, stored resources, and architectural planning. Archaeologists date Jerf el Ahmar broadly to around 9,500 to 8,700 BC and place it among key early Neolithic sites of the northern Syrian Euphrates, excavated in the 1990s before the area was submerged by the Tishrin Dam reservoir. That is why it matters so much. Jerf el Ahmar was a village before villages were supposed to matter in the older, simpler version of the story. It sits at that awkward and fascinating point where our categories begin to wobble. Were these people hunter-gatherers? Yes, in many important ways. Were they settled villagers? Also yes, in ways that are difficult to ignore. Were they farmers? Not exactly. Not in the later sense of fully domesticated fields and predictable agricultural routine. But were they already changing their relationship with plants, storage, labour and place? Very much so. Human history, as usual, refuses to line up neatly for our convenience. It behaves less like a staircase and more like a drawer full of old cables, where everything connects somehow, but not in the order you expected. When archaeologists look at a place like Jerf el Ahmar, they are not only looking for beautiful objects or dramatic discoveries, they are looking for patterns. Where were the buildings placed? How were they shaped? Were they rebuilt in the same area? Were there workspaces, storage spaces, hearths, benches, floors, post holes, or signs of repeated use? Did the settlement shift over time? Were certain structures different from ordinary houses? These are quiet clues, but they can tell us a great deal. A village is not simply a collection of walls. It is a pattern of decisions. A house here, a path there, a shared structure in the centre, storage hidden or protected, entrances facing particular directions, old buildings abandoned and new ones built over or near them. Each decision may have been practical at the time, but together they reveal a community organising itself. At Jerf el Ahmar, the buildings were not all the same. The site is especially known for both domestic architecture and larger special buildings that seem to have served communal or non-domestic functions. Reviews of Daniel Storder's work on the site emphasise how its architecture forced scholars to reconsider early Neolithic social life, especially because of impressive subterranean communal buildings and evidence connected with the transition towards sedentary farming communities. This does not mean we can wander through the ancient settlement with total confidence and say, this room was for meetings, this one was for arguing, and this corner was where someone always left the baskets. Archaeology does not allow that kind of certainty, but the distinction between ordinary houses and unusual shared structures is important. It suggests that people were not simply living side by side, they were doing some things together in built spaces designed for more than one household. That is a very big step. A family can build a shelter because it needs cover. A group builds a communal structure because it needs a place to gather, store, perform, decide, prepare, or remember. The exact function can be debated, and often is, because archaeologists are human beings and therefore enjoy disagreeing in organised ways. But the presence of such buildings tells us that community life had taken on a material form. Social relationships had become architecture. Cooperation was not just something people did in passing, it was something they built into the ground. Picture for a moment a settlement that is still close to the older world of movement. People know the surrounding land deeply. They hunt, they gather, they harvest wild plants, they understand seasons and animal behaviour. They may still move at certain times or maintain connections with other places. Yet here, at Jerf el Ahmar, there are houses that last long enough to be rebuilt, work areas that accumulate traces, and shared buildings that require planning. This is not a temporary camp where everyone will be gone in the morning. It is a place to return to, a place that can hold equipment and memory. And once a place begins to hold memory, people treat it differently. The houses themselves matter because they show everyday life becoming fixed enough to leave a clear footprint. Domestic structures in early Neolithic settlements often reveal how people arranged food preparation, sleeping, tool use, and storage. Walls create private or household space. Floors gather debris from work and meals. Hearths mark repeated cooking and warmth. Grinding stones mark labour that is heavy and repetitive. Even the repair of a floor or the rebuilding of a wall tells us something simple but powerful. People expected the place to continue. A repaired house is a small vote for the future. It says, not in words but in effort, we will be here again. At Jerf el Ahmar there is also evidence of architectural development over time. The settlement did not remain frozen in one form, it changed. Some early Neolithic sites in this region show shifts from more rounded buildings toward more rectilinear architecture, and Jerf el Ahmar is often discussed in relation to these broader changes. A formal architectural study of structures at Jerf el Ahmar even identified geometric regularities and suggested the use of a measurement unit, which points toward careful planning rather than casual building. That may sound like a technical detail, but it is quietly remarkable. Measurement means coordination. Repeated forms mean shared building knowledge. Geometry means people were not only making shelter, they were making ordered space, and ordered space changes behaviour. A round hut, a rectangular room, a sunken communal building, a storage cell, a bench, a doorway, a platform. These are not just physical features. They guide how people move and gather. They decide who can see whom, who sits where, who enters, who waits, who stores, who retrieves. In a small mobile camp, social order may be carried mostly through custom, kinship, speech, and habit. In a village, some of that order begins to be built into the environment. A wall does not need to speak to separate one activity from another. A bench does not need to explain that people are meant to sit along it. A storage room does not need to announce that future food matters. It simply exists, and people organise themselves around it. This is where Jerf el Ahmar becomes especially interesting for the story of early settled life. It was not simply that people built houses. Many human groups have built shelters of different kinds for a very long time. What matters is the combination: repeated settlement, communal buildings, intensive plant processing, storage, and social spaces. These things together suggest a community that was learning how to live in a more fixed and coordinated way. Not necessarily peacefully all the time. We should be careful not to turn early villages into sleepy little scenes of perfect harmony, with everyone sharing grain and smiling gently at the sunrise. Human beings do not become saints just because they live in mud brick or stone structures. If anything, living closer together gives people more opportunities to be generous, and more opportunities to be irritating. A village requires cooperation, but it also creates tension. When people store food, questions follow. Who gathered it? Who processed it? Who has access to it? Who decides when it is used? If a communal building stores grain or hosts gatherings, who controls that space? Who cleans it? Who builds it? Who gets the best place to sit? The moment humans live together in a stable settlement, daily life becomes more socially complicated. Not in a bad way, necessarily. Complexity can mean support, safety, shared labour, care for children, help during shortage, and stronger identity. But it also means negotiation. Every village, no matter how early, is partly a machine for turning many individual needs into a shared routine. Jerf el Ahmar gives us a chance to see that machine while it was still new. Later villages in the Near East would become more familiar to us. with clearer agricultural economies, more standardised house forms, pottery, larger populations, and increasingly visible social differences. But Jerf el Ahmar belongs to a moment before that later package had fully come together. It shows us that village life did not wait politely for domesticated farming to be completed. People were already experimenting with settled forms of life while still relying heavily on wild resources. Large-scale cereal processing before full domestication has been identified at the site, showing that wild grain use could support major shifts in labour and settlement before later agriculture became fully established. That matters because it changes the old question. Instead of asking why did farming create villages, we might ask, how did villages help create farming? If people gather in one place, use certain plants heavily, store food, process grain with fixed equipment, and return year after year, they begin putting pressure on the plants and the landscape. They favour certain species. They harvest in repeated ways. They may disturb soil, scatter seeds, protect useful stands, or return to places where desirable plants grow. No one has to wake up and declare the invention of agriculture. A long chain of practical choices can slowly move people in that direction. The village is not merely a result of farming. It can also be one of the settings in which farming becomes more likely. Of course, Jerf el Ahmar was not alone. It belonged to a wider world of early Neolithic communities in the northern Levant and upper Mesopotamia, a region that has produced several sites with surprising architecture, symbolism, and evidence of social organisation. Scholars have noted that discoveries in this region, including large communal buildings with benches at Jerf el Ahmar, revealed a new dimension to the earliest Neolithic and helped draw attention to northern Levantine cultural complexity. This wider context is important because it reminds us that Jerf el Ahmar was not an isolated spark. It was part of a broader pattern of human communities experimenting with new ways of living. Still, every site has its own character. Jerf el Ahmar's village life was shaped by its river setting, its architecture, its plant economy, and its repeated occupation. We can imagine the settlement not as a tidy diagram, but as a lived place. Houses clustered close enough for people to know each other's routines, work taking place indoors and outdoors, food being carried, sorted, ground, cooked and stored, people moving between domestic spaces and shared areas, children learning by watching, copying, interrupting, and probably asking questions at the most inconvenient time, older adults holding knowledge of seasons, routes, tools and stories, visitors arriving along the river corridor with news or materials, dogs nosing around hearths, smoke drifting, dust settling, someone repairing a wall that had seemed perfectly fine until it suddenly became everyone's problem. It is in these ordinary scenes that the importance of the village becomes clear. We often look for dramatic moments in human history. The first farmer, the first temple, the first city, the first king, the first person to look at a wild goat and think, perhaps unwisely, that this relationship could be made more permanent. But history is usually made from repeated ordinary acts, grinding grain again and again, returning to the same houses, building a shared structure, teaching a child where food is stored, repairing a floor, holding a gathering, remembering the dead in relation to a place. These acts do not look dramatic from the inside, but over generations they transform the possibilities of human life. A village also changes time. Not time in the cosmic sense, where physicists begin bending clocks and making everyone nervous, but social time. In a mobile life, memory may be distributed across many places on a seasonal round. In a settled or semi-settled village, more memories accumulate in one location. That wall was built by someone's parent. That hearth has been used for many seasons. That communal building has hosted gatherings people can remember. That storage space carries last year's labour into this year's hunger. The settlement becomes a container for past effort. It also becomes a bet on future return. People invest because they expect continuity. This is one reason architecture can be so revealing. Buildings are not only practical, they are time made visible. A quick shelter says, "We are here for now." A repaired house says, "We are still here." A rebuilt settlement says, "This place remains important." A communal building says, "Our group has activities that need a shared setting." At Jerf el Ahmar, those messages appear in the ground, not as writing, but as repeated construction, design, and use. Before people had written records, they were already leaving records in architecture. The phrase, "before villages were supposed to matter," is useful because it reminds us how much our expectations have changed. For older models of the Neolithic, the most important turning point was often domestication itself. Once people controlled plants and animals, then settled life became possible. But the evidence from sites like Jerf el Ahmar complicates that sequence. It suggests that settlement, social gathering, storage, plant use and architecture were developing together, each one encouraging the others. People did not simply become farmers and then settle down. In some places they settled more deeply and then became farmers over time. This does not make the story less scientific. It makes it more human. Real human change is messy. People try things. Some things work. Some things are abandoned. New habits form because they solve immediate problems, not because anyone can see where they will lead after thousands of years. A group may gather at Jerf el Ahmar because the riverbank is useful. They may build because returning becomes easier than starting over. They may store grain because seasonal abundance can be turned into future security. They may create communal spaces because larger groups need places to coordinate or mark shared events. None of this requires a grand plan. It requires intelligence, habit, and the slow accumulation of consequences. There is also a social comfort in a village, though comfort should not be overstated. Living together can provide protection and help. A person who is ill may be supported. Children can be watched by more than one adult. Labour can be shared. Knowledge can be pooled. If a hunt fails, stored plant food may help. If one household struggles, others may assist, depending on the social rules and relationships involved. But living together also means visibility. People know what others do. They see who contributes and who does not. They remember favours and failures. A village creates community, and community is both shelter and pressure. Anyone who has ever lived with neighbours will understand this without needing a grant-funded excavation. The special buildings at Jerf el Ahmar sharpen this point. A communal structure is not simply a bigger house. It suggests moments when the group came together in ways that needed a distinct setting. Some interpretations have connected these buildings with storage, feasting, ritual, or social organisation, though exact functions remain debated. The important thing is that architecture created a stage for collective life. Not a stage in the theatrical sense, with curtains and someone forgetting their lines, but a physical space where people could act as a group. In early village life, that may have been essential. Shared food, shared labour, shared memory, and shared ritual all help hold a community together when daily life becomes more settled. The village also changes identity. A mobile group may define itself through kinship, movement, territory, and seasonal knowledge. A settled group begins to define itself through place as well. We are the people of this riverbank, the people near this cliff, the people who use this building, the people whose dead are connected to this ground. Again, we cannot know their words or exact ideas, but the material pattern suggests that place was becoming socially important. Jerf el Ahmar was not just where life happened, it was part of how life was organised. One of the most useful ways to think about Jerf el Ahmar is as a practical experiment that lasted long enough to matter. It was not a modern experiment, of course. There were no notebooks, no control groups, and no one saying, "Let us test whether sedentism increases long-term serial dependence." People were simply living. But from our distance, the settlement looks like a living experiment in how humans could gather differently. What happens when wild grain is processed in large quantities? What happens when heavy tools stay in one place? What happens when shared buildings become central? What happens when the riverbank becomes a home rather than a stop? Jerf el Ahmar does not answer these questions with a neat conclusion. It answers with layers of occupation, architecture, and remains. And because the site was excavated under rescue conditions before flooding, there is a particular urgency to what was recorded. The archaeological work was limited by time, yet it revealed enough to make the settlement one of the important examples in discussions of early Neolithic complexity. That gives the village a strange double life. In the ancient past, it was a place where people learned to stay. In the modern present, it is a place we can no longer visit in the ordinary way. It exists through excavation records, publications, drawings, photographs, samples, and the careful work of interpretation. The village that once held people now holds questions. If we walk through it carefully in imagination, we would not see a city in miniature. That would be the wrong image. We would see something more modest and more important, a community at the threshold of a new way of living. Houses grouped together, work repeated, grain processed, shared buildings entered, knowledge carried from season to season. People still deeply connected to wild landscapes, but increasingly tied to a built place. No king was needed to make this meaningful. No writing was needed to make it complex. No city walls were needed to make it part of a major human transformation. The village mattered because it made new kinds of life possible. It gave food a place to be stored, tools a place to remain, people a place to gather, memory a place to settle, and future plans a place to begin. It allowed daily routine to accumulate into social structure. It turned the riverbank into a centre, and once a centre exists, even a small one, the world around it is rearranged. Paths lead toward it. Work returns to it. Stories attach to it. Children grow up with it as part of what normal life means. So the people of Jerf el Ahmar were not simply living before history. They were making history in a form that looked, from the outside, like ordinary village life. That is often how the largest changes begin. Not with a declaration, not with a monument, but with people deciding again and again to come back to the same place, to build a little more, to store a little more, to trust the next season just enough to prepare for it, to gather with others in a structure made for more than one household, to let a settlement become part of their lives until the village was no longer just a convenience beside the Euphrates, but a framework for being human in a new way. And once we notice that, the houses and paths begin to lead us toward the stranger buildings at the heart of the site, the ones that were not quite homes, not quite storage rooms in the simple sense, not easy to explain with one tidy label. They were larger, deeper, more carefully arranged, and they suggest that gathering itself had become something people built for, protected, and perhaps filled with meanings that reach beyond ordinary domestic work. The buildings at Jerf el Ahmar are strange in the best archaeological sense. Not strange because they belong to some fantasy world, or because we need to imagine secret ceremonies every time someone digs up a curved wall, but strange because they do not fit neatly into the simplest version of what an 11,000-year-old settlement is supposed to look like. If we expected only small homes, hearths, scattered tools, and the everyday traces of families making a living by the river, Jerf el Ahmar quietly raises a hand and says, "Not quite." Beneath the dust were ordinary domestic buildings, yes, but also larger communal structures, some rounded, some sunken into the ground, some fitted with benches, internal cells, and carefully arranged features that suggest people were doing more than simply sleeping, cooking, and trying to keep the roof from becoming part of the floor. Scholars describe several of these structures, including EA7 and EA30, as subterranean circular buildings with small chambers and bench segments, clearly different from the surface houses around them. A house is usually easy enough to understand at a basic level. People need shelter, they need warmth, shade, a place to prepare food, somewhere to sleep, and somewhere to put the things they are definitely going to use later, even if later sometimes means never. But a communal building asks a different question. Who built it? Who used it? Who maintained it? Who was allowed inside? Why make it larger, deeper, more formal, or more carefully arranged than an ordinary household space? Those questions are important because the moment people begin constructing buildings that belong to the group rather than to one family, the settlement becomes more than a cluster of shelters. It becomes a social organism with shared spaces built into its body. At Jerf el Ahmar, these special structures were not accidental. They were part of the settlement's organisation. The site had multiple phases of occupation, and in several levels domestic units appear associated with special buildings that seem to have had a communal function. That pattern matters because it suggests repetition. This was not one odd building made once because someone had an unusual idea, and the rest of the group decided to humour them. The idea of a shared building seems to have been part of how the community arranged itself. People returned to that form, they rebuilt, they repeated, and repetition is one of the ways archaeologists recognise that an action has become important. The roundness of these buildings draws attention first, partly because it feels different from the later rectangular architecture we often associate with settled villages. In many early Neolithic settings, rounded and semi-subterranean forms appear before or alongside more rectangular plans, and Jerf el Ahmar sits right in that moment of architectural change. A round building behaves differently from a rectangular one. It has no obvious front corner, no simple line of rooms, no easy division into neat domestic compartments. People sitting or standing inside a round space face each other more naturally. Movement circulates. A bench around the edge can gather people into a shared interior. It is not hard to imagine a group seated there, listening, talking, sharing food, planning work, marking an event, or simply waiting for someone to finish saying something they could have said in half the time. Human meetings, after all, may be nearly as old as human settlement, but we have to stay careful. A round building is not automatically a temple. A bench is not automatically a shrine. A decorated stone is not automatically proof of priesthood, hierarchy, or a full ceremonial system. Archaeology is most convincing when it resists the temptation to make every unusual structure dramatic. These buildings were special, but special can mean several things. They may have been used for storage. They may have been used for food processing or distribution. They may have hosted gatherings, rituals, teaching, decision-making, feasting, or all of these at different times. A building does not have to do only one job. Modern kitchens are places for cooking, eating, arguing, remembering appointments, charging phones, and quietly eating something directly from the container while pretending it counts as tidying up. Ancient buildings could also be flexible. One of the reasons the communal structures at Jerf el Ahmar attract so much attention is that they seem to connect social life with food storage and processing. Researchers discussing the site have noted that large structures with internal benches imply communal gatherings and grain storage, placing Jerf el Ahmar among the important early Neolithic examples that revealed unexpected complexity in the northern Levant. This is a very important combination. Gathering and storage are not separate matters. If a group stores food together, the stored food becomes social. It has to be protected, counted, remembered, shared, or controlled in some way. If people gather in the same building where food is kept, then the building may become a place where practical and symbolic life overlap. Grain can be calories, but it can also be trust. It can be labour made visible. It can be the group's answer to hunger next month. That gives a storage space weight beyond its walls. Imagine entering one of these sunken round buildings when it was in use. You do not step into a bright room with a flat ceiling and a label on the door. You move downward, perhaps by an entrance or passage, into a cooler interior. The walls are close and curved. Benches line parts of the inside. Wooden posts may have supported the roof structure in some examples. One reconstruction description notes posts set into the stone wall and a bench made with massive decorated slabs. Light would have been limited depending on the roof and entrance. Sounds would change inside the space. Voices would be contained. The smell might be of earth, stored plants, dust, bodies, smoke from nearby hearths, and worked materials. If the building held grain or legumes, then it also held the smell of dry stored food, the quiet smell of future meals. That sunken quality matters. Building downward takes effort. Digging into the ground, lining walls, arranging posts and benches, and creating a stable structure is not the easiest way to make a room. People usually do difficult things because the difficulty gives them something in return. A subterranean building can be cooler, more stable in temperature, and useful for storage. It can also feel different from ordinary houses because entry into it is controlled. You go down into it. You do not simply wander through as if passing by someone's doorway. The physical act of descent can make a place feel set apart, even if its purpose is practical. A storage cellar and a meeting chamber can both benefit from being partly below ground. At Jerf el Ahmar, the fact that these buildings were larger than domestic houses and set apart in form suggests that people recognise them as different kinds of spaces. Some of the buildings also included decorative or symbolic elements. Reports on Jerf el Ahmar mention decorated benches, geometric motifs, sculpted features, and animal imagery, including references to a pillar with a snake in communal building EA53. Again, this does not let us read the minds of the people who made them. A snake may have meant danger, protection, renewal, water, the underworld, a story, a clan marker, or something else entirely. It may have meant several things. It may have meant something obvious to them and completely unavailable to us, which is archaeology's favourite way of keeping everyone humble. But decoration tells us that function was not the whole story. These structures were not only holes in the ground for putting things. People invested attention in how they looked, how they were marked, and what they communicated. Decoration takes time. It requires someone to carve, arrange, and decide that a surface should carry a pattern or image. In a world where daily labour was demanding, that decision matters. It does not mean everyone had leisure in the modern sense, sitting around wondering how to fill a quiet afternoon. It means that visual marking was part of the work of making a place. Humans rarely build purely functional spaces when a place matters to them. We mark rooms, walls, tools, doorways, clothing, bodies, and objects because we live through meaning as well as necessity. Even the most practical storage building can become important enough to decorate if it stands at the centre of group life. The benches are especially interesting because benches shape people, not in a mysterious way, just in a very practical one. A bench tells bodies where to sit. A circular or curving bench creates a particular social arrangement. It may allow participants to face the interior or look toward a central space. It may make some positions more prominent than others. It may create room for a group to assemble while keeping movement open. If the bench is decorated, the sitting place itself becomes visually significant. The building guides behaviour without needing anyone to explain the rules every time. You enter, you sit, you face inward, you join the gathering. Now, what kind of gathering was it? This is where interpretation becomes cautious. It could have involved food preparation or distribution. It could have involved seasonal events tied to harvests of wild grain. It could have involved the storage and management of shared resources. It could have involved rituals connected to ancestors, animals, or group identity. It could have hosted meals where food was consumed in ways that helped bind the community together. Feasting has often been discussed in relation to early Neolithic social life, because shared meals can do powerful social work. They create obligation, memory, status, generosity, and sometimes indigestion. But we should not assume every communal building was a feast hall. The quieter possibility is just as important. These buildings may have been where the community managed the practical demands of living together. The practical demands were not small. If Jerf el Ahmar's people were processing wild cereals at significant scale, then grain had to move through many stages. It had to be harvested, transported, sorted, dried, stored, ground, cooked, and shared. Storage in particular changes the social environment. Food that can be stored is food that can be accumulated. Accumulated food can smooth over shortages, but it can also create questions about ownership and access. A shared storage building may reduce risk for the group, but only if people trust the rules around it. If those rules fail, stored food becomes a very efficient way to create arguments. A communal structure may therefore have been not only a place for holding grain, but a place for holding the social agreements that made grain storage possible. This is one reason the strange round buildings beneath the dust may be central to the whole story of Jerf el Ahmar. They show that people were not only changing what they ate or where they slept, they were changing how they organised cooperation. A settlement with shared buildings has to coordinate labour. Someone must gather materials, someone must help dig, someone must build walls, set posts, prepare floors, arrange stones, maintain the roof, clean the interior, repair damage, and decide what happens when the structure is no longer usable. In some cases, buildings at early Neolithic sites appear to have been deliberately abandoned or filled, suggesting that closing a building could be as meaningful as opening it. Whether every case at Jerf el Ahmar fits that pattern exactly should be handled carefully, but the broader point remains: architecture has a life cycle, and communities manage that life cycle together. There is something quietly powerful about the fact that these buildings were partly hidden even when they were new. A sunken structure is visible from outside, of course, especially if it has a roof or entrance, but much of its volume is below the surface. It belongs to the ground. To enter it is to leave the open settlement and move into a controlled interior. In a hot or exposed environment, that may be useful. In a social environment, it may be meaningful. It creates contrast. Outside, there are houses, work areas, paths, children, animals, sunlight, smoke, and movement. Inside, there is enclosure, seating, stored material, perhaps decoration, perhaps controlled access. The building separates one kind of activity from another. A village before full farming needs such separations because life is becoming more complicated. A simple camp may have flexible zones. Here we sleep, here we cook, here we work. But a more permanent settlement accumulates tasks. Some are household tasks, some are collective, some are ordinary, some are occasional. A communal building helps divide those activities. It creates a place where the group can act as a group. That may sound obvious, but it is a major social invention. The group becomes something that has architecture. We should pause here with the word communal, because it can sound too soft. Communal does not necessarily mean equal, peaceful, or free of tension. It simply means shared in some form. A communal building may be used by all, controlled by some, maintained by many, entered by a few, or understood differently by different people. It may reflect cooperation, but also emerging authority. It may be where elders speak, where certain lineages store food, where ritual specialists perform, or where households negotiate shared work. We do not know the exact arrangement at Jerf el Ahmar, but the existence of communal buildings makes it reasonable to think that social roles were becoming more defined than in smaller, more temporary groups. Not necessarily classes, not kings, not bureaucracy, just the early thickening of community life. The buildings also make us think about labour. It takes shared labour to build something large and partly underground. That labour must be organised, even if informally. People must agree that the work is worth doing. Agreement can come from necessity, tradition, persuasion, obligation, kinship, ritual, or someone with a very convincing personality. However it happened, the building is evidence that enough people participated in a common project. This is one of the earliest visible forms of community decision-making. Not democracy in the modern sense, not leadership in the later state sense, but coordinated action. The structure is the result. It is worth comparing these communal structures with the ordinary houses around them, because the contrast is the point. Domestic buildings hold the repeated life of households. They are where food is prepared in smaller amounts, where people rest, where family routines unfold. The special buildings are larger or differently arranged, and they pull attention toward the community as a whole. At Jerf el Ahmar, some reconstructions show the settlement organised around a central circular subterranean building, with nearby rectangular buildings furnished with large quern stones, interpreted as communal installations for processing grain and legumes stored in the central building. That arrangement, if accepted, gives a very concrete picture of how food and architecture work together. The central building stored resources. The surrounding work buildings processed them. The village was not just a place to live, it was a place to organise labour around plants. This kind of arrangement also points toward an important shift in human attention. Wild plants had always mattered, but processing them at large scale in a semi-settled or settled environment changes their role. Grain becomes something around which buildings are arranged. It becomes a reason for communal equipment. It becomes a focus of scheduling and storage. Once that happens, plant food is no longer just gathered from the landscape and eaten. It is built into architecture. It has a place in the village plan. That is an early sign of the larger transformation that will eventually lead to farming societies, even if the people at Jerf el Ahmar were not yet farmers in the later sense. The strange buildings also show us that the early Neolithic was not only an economic transition. It was not simply about calories. Calories matter, of course. Anyone who says food is not central to history has probably eaten recently. But food is always social. How it is gathered, stored, prepared, served, and shared tells people who they are to each other. A shared storage building can say, "We depend on one another." A special interior can say, "This activity is not ordinary." A decorated bench can say, "This place carries memory or meaning." A communal building can say, "The group exists beyond individual households." That message may not be written anywhere, but it is built into the structure. There is also the question of visibility. Some communal activities are public because being seen matters. A shared meal is not only about eating, it is about being seen eating together. Food distribution is not only about calories, it is about fairness, status, generosity, and trust. If grain was processed in communal installations, the work itself may have been socially visible. People could see who contributed. They could see the scale of stored food. They could participate in routines that linked households into a larger whole. The building becomes a place where social memory is made by repetition. We came here last season. We stored grain here. We sat there. We repaired that wall. We remembered that person. We will return. And yet, for all their importance, these buildings were still made of local materials by human hands. They were not magical. They had roofs that could leak, walls that could crack, floors that could wear down, and interiors that probably needed cleaning. The more we remember that, the more real the site becomes. It is easy to look at a plan drawing and forget the dust, effort, smell, noise, and small frustrations of construction. Someone had to move the stones, someone had to shape the bench, someone had to hold a post steady, someone had to say no, more to the left, and someone else probably had strong feelings about that. The finished building may look formal in a diagram, but its creation was physical, social, and probably not entirely free of irritation. That physical work tells us these people were investing in permanence, or at least in continuity. A sunken communal building is not something you make for one casual afternoon. It implies that the settlement expected repeated use. Even if people still move seasonally or maintain mobility in some parts of life, this place had become stable enough to justify heavy building. The architecture held the expectation of return. That is one of the clearest signs of village life becoming rooted. The round buildings also complicate our assumptions about what came first, practical organisation or symbolic life. At Jerf el Ahmar, they seem to be mixed together. Storage and gathering, benches and decoration, grain and social space. We do not need to choose between a practical building and a meaningful one. Human beings rarely separate those categories so neatly. A dining table is practical, but it can also be where a family gathers, argues, celebrates, remembers, and negotiates. A church basement can store chairs, host meals, serve coffee, hold meetings, and become the most important room in a community for reasons no architectural historian would guess from the floor plan alone. Buildings gather meanings by being used. At Jerf el Ahmar, the repeated use of special architecture suggests that the community had developed habits around shared space. These habits may have helped manage the transition toward more settled life. The more people stayed, the more they needed ways to coordinate. The more they stored, the more they needed trust and access rules. The more they processed grain, the more they needed equipment and labour organisation. The more they gathered in fixed places, the more those places became part of identity. The strange round buildings beneath the dust were not ornaments added to village life. They were part of the machinery that made village life work. This is why archaeologists spend so much time on walls, floors, benches, and post holes. To a casual observer, a post hole may not seem thrilling. It is a hole where a post used to be, which is not usually the beginning of a gripping bedtime story. But a post hole tells us there was a roof. A roof tells us the space was covered. A covered space tells us people cared about protecting what happened inside. A bench tells us bodies gathered there. A storage cell tells us material was kept there. A decorated slab tells us someone wanted the place marked. Bit by bit, architecture turns from dirt into behaviour. If we imagine the building in use, the scene does not need to be dramatic. Perhaps it is a seasonal gathering after plant harvests. People bring baskets of grain or legumes. Some food is stored, some processed nearby, some cooked. Older members of the group sit along a bench. Children peer in from the edge until someone tells them to move or help. There may be formal speech, or there may simply be work. A few objects or images on stone surfaces carry meanings everyone present understands without needing explanation. The building is cool, dim, and familiar. It smells of stored plants and earth. It is not a palace, not a temple in any certain later sense, not a government office, thankfully. It is something older and less easily named, a built centre for shared life. That difficulty in naming it is actually useful. If we call it a temple too quickly, we import later ideas. If we call it a storehouse only, we flatten its social importance. If we call it a meeting hall, we imagine arrangements that may not fit. The safest term is often communal building, but even that is a label covering many possibilities. What matters is that these structures show shared investment, repeated use, and a relationship between architecture, food, and social gathering. They are evidence that people at Jerf el Ahmar were creating places where the community could become visible to itself. And this brings us back to the larger question of why humans were gathering here 11,000 years ago. The river drew people, yes. The village held them, yes. But these special buildings show that gathering itself had become organised. People were not just gathering in the general sense of being near each other. They were gathering in specific rooms, around shared structures, possibly around stored food, decorated benches, and activities that mattered to the whole group. That is a different level of social life. It turns a useful settlement into a community with built institutions, though that word sounds a little too formal for a place where no one had invented office lighting or forms in triplicate. Still, an institution at its simplest is a repeated way of doing something together. A communal building can be an institution made of earth, stone, wood, and labour. It carries rules even when they are unwritten. It tells people where to go, how to gather, what to protect, what to remember, and how the group exists beyond one household. At Jerf el Ahmar, those early institutions were not yet the temples or granaries of later urban civilization, but they may be among their distant ancestors. Not direct ancestors in a straight line, but early examples of humans building shared spaces around shared needs. The dust covered these buildings for thousands of years, and then excavation uncovered them for a brief modern moment before the reservoir covered the site again. That makes them feel almost borrowed from time, but their message is practical and clear enough. Around 11,000 years ago, people beside the Euphrates were capable of planning, coordinating, storing, decorating, and gathering in built spaces that were more than homes. They were not waiting for civilization to begin. They were already doing some of the things that would make later civilization possible, in smaller, older, and more intimate forms. From there, the path of the settlement leads naturally toward the work that filled those structures and the hands that made the whole system useful. A communal building can hold people, memory, and stored food, but the stored food must come from somewhere. It has to be gathered from the landscape, carried back, processed with patience, ground on heavy stones, cooked into meals, and made reliable enough that a community begins to organize its days around it. The next clue is not only in the walls or benches, but in the grain, the grinding stones, and the slow, repetitive labour that helped turn a riverbank settlement into something more settled than the world had usually known. If the strange buildings of Jerf el Ahmar show us where people gathered, the grain and grinding stones show us why staying there began to make sense. Walls can tell us that a community had become organised, but food tells us what that organisation was doing every day. Food is where the big questions become practical. What will we eat when the season changes? How much can we carry? What can be stored? Who gathers it? Who prepares it? Who gets to decide when it is opened, shared, cooked, or saved for later? These are not glamorous questions, but they are the sort of questions that quietly reshape human life. Long before anyone at Jerf el Ahmar could have imagined agriculture as we understand it, people there were already handling wild cereals on a serious scale. Research on the site has described systematic harvesting and processing of wild barley about 1,000 years before barley was fully domesticated, with rows of querns installed in buildings and evidence for large-scale cereal work before farming had reached its later form. That detail is easy to pass over too quickly. Wild grain sounds modest, almost gentle, like something scattered in the landscape waiting politely to become bread. But wild cereals are not passive little gifts in tidy packets. They are seasonal, stubborn, and labour-intensive. They ripen when they ripen, not when humans find it convenient. They have husks, stems, awns, grit, dust, and all the small annoyances that come with turning a plant in the field into something edible. If you have ever opened a kitchen drawer and felt defeated by a slightly complicated utensil, it is worth pausing to appreciate the work involved in making wild grain into food, without metal tools, mills, ovens in the later sense, or a nice labelled jar saying whole grain flour. At Jerf el Ahmar, people were not simply nibbling seeds now and then. They were investing time, equipment, buildings, and collective labour into cereals. That means grain had become dependable enough, valuable enough, and socially important enough to shape the settlement. The grinding stones are among the clearest signs of this. A quern is a grinding tool, usually made from a lower stone surface, and an upper hand stone used to crush or grind seeds and grains. It is one of those simple technologies that can transform a diet, but it is not light work. Grinding grain takes strength, patience, and repetition. It also takes stone, and not just any stone. You need a surface that can withstand repeated abrasion without falling apart into the meal, unless you're especially fond of eating geology. Some accounts of Jerf el Ahmar report hundreds of querns from the site, with a smaller number found still in place, and one excavated room contained 3 saddle querns, along with other features such as stone plates, a hearth, and limestone basins. This is not a few scattered tools, it is a working system. It suggests that grinding was not a side activity done occasionally when someone felt inspired. It was part of the community's rhythm. Imagine the sound first, not the dramatic sound of battle or construction, but the low repeated scrape of stone on stone, grain placed on the surface, a handstone pushed forward, pulled back, pushed forward again. The movement is simple, but it has to be repeated hundreds and thousands of times. Dust gathers on hands, shoulders ache. Knees and backs protest quietly, or not so quietly, depending on the person. The grain breaks down gradually. It becomes coarse meal, then finer meal. Some of it may be cooked into porridge, some may be made into flat foods, some may be stored after processing or processed when needed. We do not need to imagine a bakery, and certainly not a charming little Neolithic cafe with river views and a seasonal menu. What we should imagine is sustained daily labour, because grain does not become food by being admired. This labour matters because it anchors people. Heavy grinding stones are not friendly to constant movement. You can carry small tools, baskets, blades and personal items, but a large quern is a different commitment. It belongs to a place. Once a group installs grinding stones in a building, the building becomes a food processing station. Once several such installations exist, the settlement becomes a place where food work is organised. And once food work is organised around fixed equipment, people have another reason to return. This is one of the most important points in the story of staying put. Settled life did not begin only because people domesticated plants and then needed fields. In some places, people first intensified the use of wild plants, built facilities to handle them, and created routines that made returning to the same settlement increasingly sensible. Wild grain is seasonal, but grinding stones are permanent. That contrast may have helped pull life into a new pattern. The grain comes and goes with the year. The tools remain. The people go out to harvest, but they bring the harvest back to the settlement. The grain is collected from the landscape, but it is transformed in the village. The act of grinding turns the settlement into the place where raw abundance becomes meals. And meals, as humans have always understood, are not only fuel, they are social. They bring people together, mark time, create obligations, and occasionally reveal who has been taking more than their fair share when nobody was looking. The cereals used at Jerf el Ahmar were still wild, which means they had not yet undergone the full genetic and physical changes that later defined domesticated crops. In wild cereals, ripe seeds tend to fall naturally from the plant, a useful strategy for the plant, but not always convenient for humans trying to harvest them. Domesticated cereals eventually developed traits that made them easier for people to gather, including tougher seed heads that held onto grain until harvest. But before that full domestication, people could still harvest wild stands intensively. They could time their collection carefully. They could use tools. They could return to productive areas. They could perhaps encourage useful plants indirectly through repeated disturbance, clearing, or sowing, although exactly how much cultivation was happening at Jerf el Ahmar remains a matter of interpretation. The important point is that the line between gathering and farming was not sharp. It was a wide, practical middle ground where people were doing more than casual foraging, but had not yet created the later agricultural world. That middle ground is one of the most fascinating parts of the early Neolithic. It asks us to stop thinking in neat boxes: hunter-gatherer, farmer, village, city, wild, domestic. These labels are useful, but people do not live inside labels. They live inside seasons, needs, habits, experiments and memories. At Jerf el Ahmar, a person could have gone out to collect wild plants, returned to a built village, processed grain on fixed equipment, stored food in a communal setting, and joined others in buildings that were not ordinary homes. What should we call that way of life? It is not simple foraging. It is not later farming. It is something in between, and that in-between state is exactly where major changes often happen. The first taste of staying put was probably not a sudden emotional revelation. It was not someone standing beside a basket of barley and declaring that humanity would now embark upon the long project of agriculture, settlement, social complexity, and eventually extremely expensive artisanal bread. More likely, staying became attractive because it solved problems. If a riverbank offered reliable access to plants, animals, water, and routes of movement, then returning there made sense. If heavy tools were already there, returning made even more sense. If grain could be stored there, the place became useful beyond the moment. If communal buildings helped manage food and group life, then the settlement became part of survival. Staying was not only a feeling, it was a practical accumulation of reasons. Storage sits at the centre of this change. A food that must be eaten immediately encourages one kind of life. A food that can be stored encourages another. Wild fruits, fresh meat, fish, and greens can be valuable, but many are short-lived unless dried, smoked, cooked, or otherwise preserved. Grain is different. Once dried and protected, it can last. It can bridge seasons. It can feed people when fresh resources are scarce. It can be moved, counted, measured, hidden, shared, or guarded. In other words, grain can become security. But security has a price. It must be gathered in quantity, processed, stored safely, and protected from damp, insects, rodents, theft, and bad planning, which may be one of the oldest pests of all. Once food is stored, people begin living with the future in a new way. A pile of grain is not just food. It is tomorrow made visible. It is labour from the past held in reserve. It is the memory of a harvest turned into a promise that the group may eat later. That sounds simple, but it changes social life. People can remain in one place longer if food reserves support them. They can plan gatherings. They can survive lean periods. They can support children, elders, and people who cannot always gather or hunt. They can also argue over access, which is less charming but historically important. Stored food creates both safety and responsibility. It makes cooperation more powerful and conflict more consequential. This may help explain why cereal processing at Jerf el Ahmar appears connected to communal organisation. If a household grinds a small amount of grain for itself, the tools and storage can remain domestic. But when grain processing happens at larger scale, with multiple querns installed in buildings, the work begins to look collective. That does not mean everyone shared everything equally. It means the settlement had spaces and equipment that made coordinated processing possible. Some buildings may have served as workrooms. Some may have stored grain or legumes. Some may have hosted meetings or activities tied to food distribution. The exact arrangements are still debated, but the broad pattern is strong. Cereal work was large enough to leave a major architectural and tool-based signature. The physical act of grinding also tells us something about time. It is slow time, repetitive time, bodily time. Hunting can be sudden and dramatic. Harvesting can be seasonal and urgent. Grinding is steady. It turns hours into meal. It asks the body to repeat a motion until the plant becomes usable. That kind of labour shapes daily routine. Someone had to do it, probably often. It may have been done by women, men, or both, depending on social organisation we cannot directly see. In many later societies, grinding became strongly associated with women's labour, but we should be cautious about projecting later patterns backward without evidence. What we can say is that whoever did it gave much of their time to a task that made settled life possible. The quiet scrape of stone may be one of the background sounds of the Neolithic transition. It is also worth thinking about taste. Not because we can reconstruct every recipe, but because food becomes meaningful through eating. Wild cereal meal could be made into porridge, gruels, flat cakes, or other cooked preparations depending on water, heat, tools, and local traditions. Archaeological evidence from early sites has increasingly shown that plant foods were not just emergency rations or dull background calories. People knew how to process them. They had preferences. They combined ingredients. They used heat, grinding, soaking, pounding, and perhaps fermentation in different ways. Jerf el Ahmar's grain was not merely an economic resource. It was something people ate, smelled, touched, shared, and judged. Somewhere in that settlement, someone probably had very clear opinions about texture. Food preferences can encourage repetition. If a certain preparation is nourishing, familiar, and socially valued, people work to reproduce it. If children grow up eating grain-based foods prepared in the settlement, those foods become part of normal life. If seasonal gatherings involve meals made from stored grain, the grain becomes part of social memory. If a communal building is associated with stored or processed cereals, the taste of those cereals may become tied to belonging. The first taste of staying put may have been literal, a familiar cooked food made possible by returning to the same place with the same tools and the same people. We should remember that grain was not the only food. The people at Jerf el Ahmar would have relied on a mixed economy, including hunting, gathering, and a variety of plant and animal resources. Early settled life did not mean everyone suddenly sat around eating barley 3 times a day and discussing the benefits of fibre. A diverse diet would have been important. Animals, wild plants, nuts, fruits, legumes, and other foods all played roles. But cereals had special qualities. They could be gathered in bulk. They could be dried and stored. They could be processed into filling foods. They could support larger groups and longer stays. That made them especially important in the shift toward village life. The relationship between grain and architecture is one of the most important clues. When a food becomes central enough that buildings are arranged around its storage and processing, the settlement itself begins to reflect the diet. The village is no longer just near food. It is built to handle food. At Jerf el Ahmar, rows of querns in buildings suggest a degree of planning. The stones were placed for use, not randomly left behind. A room with multiple grinding installations suggests several people could work at once, or that the activity was repeated at significant scale. This creates an image of organised food production before the full domestication of crops, a world where people were already behaving in some ways like future farming communities while still depending on wild plant populations. That is the quiet importance of the phrase before domestication. It reminds us that humans did not wait for plants to become domesticated before changing their own lives. People altered their behaviour first. They gathered more, they processed more, they stored more, they built more. Over time, these human behaviours created new selective pressures on plants. When people repeatedly harvested certain stands, favoured larger grains, moved seeds, disturbed soils, or protected useful plants, they began shaping plant evolution even without knowing it. Domestication is not only something humans did to plants. It is something that emerged from a relationship between human habits and plant biology over many generations. At Jerf el Ahmar, this relationship seems to have been especially active. The evidence for substantial cereal processing suggests that wild plants had become deeply integrated into the settlement economy. Whether these cereals were still gathered from natural stands or already cultivated in some form, or some mixture of both, the community was relying on them heavily enough to build around them. This is what makes the site so valuable. It shows a stage in which people were not yet fully agricultural, but were already living with grain in a way that pointed toward agriculture. The grinding stones also speak to the body in another way. Repeated grinding leaves marks not only on tools, but on people. In later archaeological populations, heavy repetitive labour can affect bones and joints. While we must be cautious about making specific claims for every individual at Jerf el Ahmar, the general point remains: food processing is embodied labour. The Neolithic transition was not simply an idea or an economic system. It was shoulders, wrists, knees, backs, hands, and time. It was people bending over stones, carrying baskets, cleaning seeds, tending fires, and turning gathered plants into meals day after day. The great transformation towards settled life passed through ordinary bodies. There is a strange tenderness in that, though we do not need to make it sentimental. These were not symbols in a textbook. They were people doing necessary work. Some mornings they may have been tired. Some days the grain may have been damp. Some stones may have cracked. Some batches may have burned. Someone may have spilled something and been remembered for it longer than was strictly fair. The past becomes more real when we allow it to contain small frustrations. A village is built not only through success, but through repeated maintenance after things go slightly wrong. The more grain mattered, the more the settlement mattered. This is the feedback loop that may have helped hold people at Jerf el Ahmar. Grain processing requires tools and storage. Tools and storage encourage staying. Staying allows more organised processing. Organised processing makes grain more reliable. Reliable grain supports longer stays and larger gatherings. Larger gatherings require more social coordination, and perhaps more communal buildings. Those buildings then help manage the food and social life that staying produces. The cycle does not need a mastermind. It only needs each step to be useful enough to continue. This also changes how we imagine abundance. Wild cereal harvests may have produced moments of plenty, but plenty is only useful if it can be captured and managed. A landscape can offer resources, yet without labour and storage, those resources vanish with the season. Jerf el Ahmar's people were learning, or had already learned, how to turn seasonal abundance into stored potential. That skill is one of the foundations of later village and farming life. It allows a community to remain in place through leaner times. It allows planning. It allows gatherings that are not tied only to immediate foraging success. It allows a settlement to become more stable. But stability is never absolute. Stored food can fail. Harvests can be poor. Weather can turn. Animals can raid stores. People can fall ill. Social agreements can break down. A village dependent on stored grain is not free from risk. It has simply changed the kind of risk it faces. Mobile groups spread risk by moving across landscapes. Settled groups manage risk through storage, cooperation, and intensification. Jerf el Ahmar sits in that shifting balance. Its people were not abandoning the wild world. They were drawing parts of it into a built system. That is why the first taste of staying put was probably mixed. It offered security but demanded labour. It offered familiarity but created new obligations. It offered food reserves but required storage and protection. It offered community but made other people's habits harder to escape. Every major human transition has this quality. It solves problems while creating new ones. Settled life gave people the ability to build, store, gather and remember in one place. It also tied them more strongly to that place and to one another. The grain and grinding stones at Jerf el Ahmar show us that staying was not simply a matter of liking the riverbank. It was made through work. The settlement held because people had reasons to return, and those reasons were practical enough to endure. Heavy stones waited there. Buildings waited there. Stored food may have waited there. The memory of past labour waited there. Each return made the next return easier to imagine. Each season of processing made the settlement more central. Slowly, the place became not just somewhere people could live, but somewhere their way of living depended on. And as grain became more than a gathered plant, food itself began to change its social meaning. It was no longer only what a person found and ate. It became something stored between seasons, processed in shared spaces, worked by many hands, and perhaps used in gatherings that held the community together. A bowl of cooked grain, a basket of barley, a row of grinding stones, a storage room beneath the dust. These are modest things, but at Jerf el Ahmar they point toward a larger transformation. Food was becoming a reason to gather, a reason to build, and a reason to stay, and once food takes on that kind of power, it begins to carry meanings far beyond hunger. When food begins to last beyond the day it is gathered, it changes everything around it. A handful of berries eaten on the walk back to camp is one kind of food. A fish cooked soon after it is caught is one kind of food. A meal shared while everyone is hungry and tired is one kind of food. But a basket of grain kept dry for later is something else. It is not only a meal, it is a promise. It is work saved for the future. It is the memory of a good season waiting quietly in a container. It is the possibility that when the weather turns, when animals move away, when plants are no longer easy to find, the group may still have something to eat. At Jerf el Ahmar, this is where food begins to step out of the simple category of hunger and become part of social life, part of architecture, part of planning, and perhaps part of ritual too. That does not mean food suddenly became mysterious or sacred in a dramatic way. Most days, food was probably still food in the most direct sense. People were hungry. People worked. People ate. Someone burned something. Someone complained that it was too gritty. Someone else said it was perfectly fine and that people were becoming too particular these days. The ordinary side of eating should never disappear from the story. But in a settlement like Jerf el Ahmar, where wild cereals were gathered and processed on a significant scale before full domestication, food was beginning to do more than satisfy the body. The site has been described as a place where people harvested and processed barley roughly 1,000 years before its domestication, with rows of querns installed in buildings showing systematic production from wild cereals. That kind of evidence tells us that food had become a reason to organise space, labour and time. A meal eaten immediately belongs to the present. Stored food belongs to the future. That small difference is enormous. If you have no storage, you live more tightly bound to what can be found now, caught now, cooked now, and eaten now. If you can store grain, nuts, legumes, or dried plant foods, then the present begins to stretch forward. People can plan. They can gather more than they need for one evening. They can create reserves. They can support larger groups for longer periods. They can arrange work around seasons that have not arrived yet. A storage space is therefore not just a container. It is a way of thinking ahead with your hands. At Jerf el Ahmar, the communal buildings make this especially interesting. Large structures with internal benches have been interpreted as places for communal gathering and grain storage, which means the storage of food may have been tied to the gathering of people, rather than hidden away only inside individual households. This matters because once food is kept in a shared space, it becomes socially visible. People know it exists, they know work went into it. They may know who harvested it, who processed it, who carried it, who guarded it, and who expects to eat from it later. A storage building is quiet, but it asks loud questions. Who controls this? Who may enter? Who may take? When do we open it? How much is enough? Who decides? These are not small questions, they sit at the root of community life. A group can share food casually when resources are immediate and everyone is gathered around a fire. But stored food is different because it can be delayed, it can be counted, it can be withheld, it can be saved for a ceremony, an emergency, a winter shortage, a gathering, or a household in need. It can create trust, but it can also test trust. In that sense, stored grain is never only grain. It is a social agreement made edible. Think of the labour hidden inside a stored harvest. The grain has to be gathered at the right moment, when it's ripe enough to be useful but not so late that the seeds have scattered or been taken by animals and birds. It has to be brought back, cleaned, dried, perhaps parched, stored and protected. Some of it then has to be ground, cooked and served. Each handful represents hours of movement, knowledge, attention and bodily effort. Once food has absorbed that much labour, it becomes difficult to treat it as casual. A basket of barley is a basket of time. A bin of stored cereals is a season held in place. Food also became more than food because it could gather people. Hunger brings people together in one way, but abundance brings them together in another. When there is enough to share beyond the immediate household, eating can become an event. It can mark a successful harvest, a return, a birth, a death, a building project, a seasonal transition, or a meeting between groups. We should be careful not to claim too much here. Archaeologists cannot look at every large building and say, confidently, yes, here is where the very important dinner happened. But in early settled communities, shared food likely helped create and maintain relationships. This is a basic human pattern. We still do it. We invite people to meals to celebrate, apologize, negotiate, welcome, impress, comfort, and occasionally survive awkward family obligations with the help of bread. At Jerf el Ahmar, shared food may have helped hold together a community that was becoming more settled but not yet fully agricultural in the later sense. That position was delicate. People were still connected to wild landscapes, but they were also investing in buildings, storage, and fixed tools. They needed cooperation. They needed shared routines. They needed reasons for households to remain linked. Food is very good at doing that work because everyone understands it. A speech about communal responsibility may or may not persuade people. A shared meal after a long day of work is usually more convincing. There is also a difference between eating together and merely eating at the same time. Eating together creates memory. People remember who was there, what was served, what was said, who behaved generously, who behaved badly, and who made everyone wait. Shared meals can create obligations that last. If one household provides food today, another may be expected to contribute later. If a group works together to process grain, they may eat together afterward. If visitors arrive from another settlement or seasonal group, food can turn strangers into guests and guests into allies. In a world without writing, formal contracts or polite calendar invitations, repeated acts of feeding and being fed could help structure relationships. This is where food begins to touch the edge of ritual. Ritual does not always mean grand ceremony with elaborate symbols and dramatic silence. Sometimes ritual is simply repeated action given social importance, preparing a certain food at a certain time, bringing grain to a particular building, sitting in a particular arrangement, sharing a meal after communal work, placing food in storage with care, remembering the dead with offerings, if such practices were present. These actions can be practical and meaningful at the same time. Humans are very good at combining those two things. We can make a meal because bodies need calories, and also because the meal says something about belonging. The special buildings at Jerf el Ahmar could have supported this overlap. A structure with benches invites people to sit together. A storage area holds the results of collective labour. A decorated surface or unusual interior marks the space as different from an ordinary house. None of this proves exactly what happened there, but it suggests that some activities were set apart. If grain or legumes were stored in such a space, then food was literally placed inside the architecture of community. It was not just lying around in domestic corners, it was being held in a place that may have represented the group. Legumes also deserve a quiet place in this story. Barley tends to take the spotlight, partly because cereals are so strongly linked to the later history of agriculture. But plant remains from early Neolithic sites show that people were using a variety of resources, and recent research notes that at Jerf el Ahmar, lentil appears to have been the second most common plant taxon after barley, likely in wild form. That is important because it reminds us that early food systems were not built on a single plant. People were not simply marching toward wheat fields with barley in one hand and destiny in the other. They were working with diverse plants, each with its own season, preparation, taste, storage qualities, and social role. Legumes bring their own logic. They are nutritious, can be dried, and can complement cereals in diet. They also require knowledge. Which plants are useful? When are they ready? How should they be processed? How should they be cooked? Which ones store well? Which ones cause problems if prepared badly? The people of Jerf el Ahmar would have known these things not as scientific categories, but as lived practice. Food knowledge was probably passed through observation, repetition, correction, and the very old teaching method of someone saying more or less, "No, not like that." The more we think about food knowledge, the clearer it becomes that early village life depended on memory. Not abstract memory, but practical memory. Where plants grow, when seeds ripen, which storage spaces stay dry, which grinding stones work best, how long grain can be kept, how to tell if something is spoiled, how much is needed for a group, and how much must be saved. Food became more than food because it became a way of carrying knowledge across seasons. Each harvest tested what people remembered from the last one. Each storage decision was a lesson for the next year. A village is partly a memory device, and food is one of the things it remembers. In a smaller mobile group, knowledge travels with people. In a more settled village, knowledge also settles into places. This building is where grain is stored. This area is where grinding happens. This tool belongs here. This pit must stay dry. This bench is where elders sit, perhaps, or where certain work is done, or where people gather when food is distributed. The settlement becomes a physical map of food behaviour. Children growing up there would learn the map without needing it explained all at once. They would see where adults carried baskets, where they sorted seeds, where they ground grain, where they cooked, where food was shared, and where they were told not to touch anything. which is one of the most reliable signs that something matters. Food also became part of identity. A group's diet is never only biological, it tells people who they are. We eat this, we prepare it this way, we store it here, we gather at this time, we share with these people, we do not waste this, we save that. Over time, these habits become tradition. The people of Jerf el Ahmar may not have thought of themselves as living through a revolution, but their food routines were probably central to how they understood normal life. For a child born there, the sound of grinding stones, the smell of cooked grain or legumes, the sight of adults working in shared spaces, and the taste of seasonal meals may have formed the background of belonging. There is a practical reason this matters for the broader story of human settlement. Food that creates identity also creates attachment to place. If a certain food is prepared using tools kept in a certain village, from plants gathered in a known landscape, stored in buildings that belong to the group, then the food ties people to that place. It becomes harder to separate diet from settlement. The village is where raw plants become familiar meals. The riverbank is where seasonal work returns. The communal building is where stored food becomes shared security. Staying put, then, is not only about walls, it is about taste, habit, labour, and expectation. Of course, food can also become power. We do not need to imagine kings or chiefs at Jerf el Ahmar, and it would be too much to impose later political systems onto such an early community. But any time food is stored, some questions of authority appear. Who knows how much is stored? Who has access? Who organises labour? Who decides whether grain is saved for later or used now? Who hosts a gathering? Who gives food to visitors? These are early forms of social influence. They may have been handled through kinship, age, skill, reputation, ritual roles, or household cooperation. They may have changed from season to season. But stored food creates the possibility that some people become important because they manage, distribute, or symbolically control what others need. This is one reason archaeologists are so interested in storage systems. Storage is not just an economic convenience, it is a social turning point. Scholars have often treated the development of storage as a major part of Neolithicization because it changes how communities manage risk, labour and social relations. At Jerf el Ahmar, storage and cereal processing appear at a time when the older boundaries between mobile foraging and settled farming were still forming. That makes the site especially valuable. It lets us see food becoming socially heavy before the full agricultural world had arrived. Food can also change relationships between humans and animals. The more grain is stored, the more it attracts other species. Rodents, insects, birds, and other opportunists would have been interested in human stores, because animals are very committed archaeologists of snacks. This creates new problems. Storage must be protected. Buildings must be maintained. Containers must be checked. Losses must be managed. In a sense, stored food brings a small ecosystem into the village. Humans are not the only ones who notice that grain can last. Every storage system is also an invitation to pests, and every community that stores food must learn how to defend its future meals from tiny, persistent thieves. Cooking is another part of the transformation. The preparation of grain and legumes requires fire, water, containers or surfaces, grinding, soaking, boiling, baking, roasting, or some combination of methods. Before pottery was common, people still had ways to cook and process food using stone, baskets, skins, heated stones, hearths, and other technologies. The absence of pottery does not mean the absence of cuisine. It only means the toolkit was different. The people of Jerf el Ahmar were capable of preparing plant foods in skilled ways, and those foods would have had textures, smells and tastes familiar to the group. Cuisine matters because it turns edible things into cultural things. A raw grain is a plant part. A cooked preparation is a human product. It carries technique, it carries preference, it carries tradition. The same plant can become many foods depending on how it is ground, mixed, heated, or served. Even very simple foods can carry strong social meaning when they are repeated across years. A certain kind of porridge or flat preparation may be ordinary, but ordinary foods are often the most powerful. They are what people miss when they leave. They are what children remember. They are what make a place feel like home long before anyone uses that word in the modern sense. The first settled food traditions may have been built from exactly this kind of repetition. Not grand cuisine, not fine dining, not anything that requires a menu with unnecessary adjectives. Just reliable foods made from seasonal plants, processed with shared tools, eaten in familiar company. The power of such foods lies in their regularity. A meal that appears again and again becomes part of the structure of life. It tells people that the group has survived another cycle. It turns a harvest into a memory. It gives daily labour a visible result. There is also the issue of generosity. Food is one of the oldest ways to create bonds because it can be given. A person who gives food is not only transferring calories, they are making a claim about relationship. I have enough to share. I recognise you. I want you included. Or sometimes, I want you indebted, which is less cosy but still very human. In early villages, generosity may have helped people build status without formal authority. Someone who could organise food, host gatherings, or contribute heavily to shared stores may have gained respect. But generosity also binds the giver. If you feed others, they remember. If you fail to feed them when expected, they remember that too, probably with impressive detail. Food then becomes social memory. It records who helped, who shared, who withheld, who organised, and who ate. In a small community, memory is powerful because everyone is close enough for reputation to matter. At Jerf el Ahmar, where people were living in repeated proximity, food practices may have helped maintain cooperation. Stored grain did not manage itself. Grinding stones did not operate out of goodwill. The system required people, and people require reasons to keep cooperating. Shared meals, shared stores, and shared buildings may have provided those reasons. This does not mean every meal was peaceful. Food can unite, but it can also divide. Scarcity sharpens tensions. Unequal access creates resentment. Spoiled stores create blame. A poor harvest creates difficult choices. If a communal store runs low, the group must decide how to respond. Do they ration? Do some households leave? Do they intensify gathering? Do they rely on hunting? Do they call on relationships with other groups? These decisions are social, not only economic. Food becomes more than food most clearly when there is not enough of it. Even abundance can be complicated. A large harvest must be processed quickly enough to be useful. Labour must be organised. Storage space must be prepared. People may need to decide whether to eat, save, exchange, or display the surplus. Surplus is not simply extra, it is potential action. It can support construction projects, gatherings, visitors, ritual events, and longer occupation. It can also create inequality if some people control more than others. In the early Neolithic, surplus may have been small and unstable compared with later agricultural societies, but even modest surplus can alter social life. At Jerf el Ahmar, the connection between food and communal architecture suggests that these questions were not theoretical. People had built spaces where food-related activities could be concentrated. The rows of querns, the possible storage structures, the communal buildings with benches, the plant remains of cereals and legumes, all point to a community in which food required organisation. The more organised food became, the more it could carry meanings beyond eating. There is a calm but important lesson here. Civilization did not begin when people suddenly become interested in monuments, rulers, or writing. It began much earlier, in quieter ways, when people learned to coordinate ordinary necessities. Food storage, shared labour, seasonal planning, and communal meals may not look as dramatic as stone towers or royal inscriptions, but they are among the deep foundations of settled human life. Before there could be cities, there had to be ways of feeding people who stayed near one another. Before there could be temples, There had to be shared places that people recognised as important. Before there could be economies, there had to be trust around stored resources. And before there could be history written on tablets, there was history ground slowly between stones. This is why food at Jerf el Ahmar cannot be reduced to diet alone. It was part of the settlement structure. It influenced where people worked, how they gathered, how they planned, how they related to one another, and how they imagined the future. A grain store was a practical thing, but also a social thing. A meal was a biological need, but also a gathering. A quern was a tool, but also a sign of repeated labour tied to place. A harvest was a season's event, but also a community's test. If we listen closely to the evidence, food becomes one of the clearest voices from the site. It says that people were staying long enough to care about next season. It says they were working together enough to need shared spaces. It says they were relying on plants in a way that would eventually help lead toward farming. It says the village was not only built from earth, stone and wood, but from stored meals, repeated tasks, remembered tastes, and the social rules that gathered around them. And once food carries that much meaning, it is never far from the other powerful parts of human life. The same buildings that held grain may also have held memory. The same gatherings that shared meals may also have marked deaths, stories, animals, symbols, or ancestors. When people settle into a place, they do not bring only their tools and hunger. They bring fear, grief, identity, imagination, and the need to explain why this group, this land, and these routines matter. So from the stored grain and shared meals, the trail at Jerf el Ahmar begins to lead toward quieter and stranger signs. Skulls, images, animal forms, and the early traces of ritual life gathering beside the everyday work of survival. By the time food has become storage, labour, planning, and shared responsibility, it is already close to something else. Not separate from daily life, but layered into it. The same people who grind grain also bury their dead. The same hands that repair walls may carve signs into stone. The same buildings that hold stored food may also hold meetings, memories, and things we would now call ritual, although that word can be a little slippery. At Jerf el Ahmar, this is where the settlement becomes harder to describe in purely practical terms. There are skulls, unusual burials, decorated stones, repeated symbols, benches, buildings set apart from ordinary houses, and traces of behaviour that seem to reach beyond the immediate problem of getting dinner ready. Not away from survival, exactly, but through it. Because for humans, survival has rarely been only about staying alive. It is also about explaining who belongs, who is remembered, what places matter, and why certain actions must be done in certain ways. The first thing to say is that we should be careful. Early Neolithic ritual is not something we can watch directly. We do not have songs, spoken stories, myths, instructions, or eyewitness accounts. No one at Jerf el Ahmar left a little sign beside a bench saying, "This is where we sit for ancestor ceremonies. Please remove your sandals and do not touch the snake carving." What archaeologists have are materials and contexts. Bones, buildings, placements, marks, tools, floors, fill, fire, decoration, and the relationship between one thing and another. From these they build interpretations, but good interpretation moves slowly. It does not turn every unusual object into a shrine, or every skull into proof of ancestor worship, or every carved animal into a complete religion. The past is generous with clues, but not always with explanations. Still, the clues at Jerf el Ahmar are difficult to ignore. One of the most striking finds came from a large communal building where a human skeleton was found, with the skull and vertebrae removed, while a skull was deposited in an interior corner. The excavator Daniel Stordeur noted that the building's form, size, position and construction investment pointed toward communal use, possibly involving collective storage, meetings, and perhaps rituals. That one sentence contains a great deal. A communal building. A missing head. A skull placed separately. Storage. Meetings. Possible ritual. It is a small cluster of evidence, but it opens the door to a very different view of the settlement. Jerf el Ahmar was not only a place where people processed wild grain beside the river, it was a place where the living handle the dead in particular ways, inside buildings that mattered to the group. The removal or separation of skulls is a known theme in the broader Neolithic Near East, though its meaning varied and is still debated. In later pre-pottery Neolithic contexts, plastered skulls and skull retrieval practices are better known from sites such as Jericho and elsewhere, but the roots of head-focused treatment go deeper and are not always the same from place to place. At Jerf el Ahmar, the evidence is not simply a neat example of one well-understood custom, it is more difficult. A headless body in a communal structure can raise questions about mortuary treatment, violence, ritual deposition, ancestor practices, or some combination that does not fit our categories very well. Scholars have debated whether some headless bodies and detached skulls in the pre-pottery Neolithic relate to ancestor veneration, trophy taking, violence, or other forms of memory and identity, and one discussion specifically describes the Jerf el Ahmar skeleton as a striking case, while warning against turning all such evidence into a single story of warfare. That caution matters. It would be easy to make the skulls too dramatic. A headless skeleton catches attention immediately, because human beings are very predictable about that sort of thing. We see a missing head, and the imagination begins running ahead, often wearing unsuitable shoes. Was this a sacrifice? A victim? An honoured ancestor? A punishment? A person whose skull was removed after death for remembrance? A trophy? A special burial? The honest answer is that we cannot be completely certain. The position of bones, the state of the remains, the building context, and comparisons with other sites all help narrow the possibilities, but they do not give us a simple label. And that is fine. The point is not to force one answer. The point is to understand that the dead were being treated in ways that connected bodies, buildings, and community. This is already a major insight. When a dead person is placed in or near a communal building, or when a skull is separated and deposited in a significant place, the dead are not simply disposed of. They are incorporated into the settlement's social world. They remain part of the built environment, part of memory, part of the relationship between people and place. A body in the ground is not only a body in the ground when the ground is where the community gathers, it becomes part of the story of that room, that building, that village. It may mark ancestry, belonging, danger, victory, grief, transformation, or something we do not have words for. But whatever it meant, it was not casual. Skulls are especially powerful because the head is where humans most easily recognize identity. The face, even after death, carries personhood in a way that a shin bone usually does not, with apologies to shin bones everywhere. To remove, keep, display, bury, or relocate a skull is to handle identity in a very direct way. In many cultures, skulls have been linked with ancestors, enemies, memory, protection, power, or renewal. That does not mean Jerf el Ahmar followed any one of those later examples, but it helps explain why the head would become a focus in human ritual life. A skull is both a person and no longer a person. It is intimate and unsettling at the same time. It can stand for someone who is gone, or for a relationship between the living and the dead. In a settled village, that relationship may have become especially important. Mobile groups also remember the dead, of course, and may have rich burial traditions. But when people begin investing in a fixed place, the dead can become attached to that place in a new way. Houses, communal buildings, storage areas, and burial locations all begin to hold memory together. A settlement is not just where people live now. It becomes where people lived before. It accumulates generations. It gives the living a reason to say, this place is ours, not only because we use it, but because those before us are here too. Even when the exact ritual meaning is uncertain, the connection between bodies and built spaces suggests that place and memory were becoming tightly linked. The symbols at Jerf el Ahmar add another layer, Decorated stones and carved motifs from the site include snakes, birds, geometric patterns, and other images arranged in ways that suggest deliberate visual communication rather than idle scratching. A recent study of Neolithic imagery notes that at Jerf el Ahmar, a grooved stone shows an X-shaped arrangement of snakes, accompanied by other images including snakes, a bird, and unidentified shapes. The same study argues that repeated combinations and ordered arrangements of signs at early Neolithic sites may point toward codified symbolic systems. That does not mean writing, it does not mean we can translate the images, but it does mean people were making marks that likely carried shared meanings. The stones were not random doodles made while someone waited for grain to cook. Snakes appear repeatedly in the early Neolithic symbolic world of northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia. At Jerf el Ahmar, Stordur's report describes decorated stone slabs and pillars in a round communal building, with chevrons and an undulating line interpreted as a serpent, calling the serpent a frequent symbol at the site and identifying the building as a meeting place and perhaps ritual space. Why snakes? That is a tempting question, but a dangerous one if we answer too confidently. Snakes shed skin, move silently, live close to the ground, appear suddenly, can be dangerous, and often attract human attention. Later cultures around the world have linked snakes to renewal, water, death, healing, fertility, danger, and protection. But we cannot simply borrow those meanings and paste them onto Jerf el Ahmar. The people there had their own associations. A snake may have meant something very specific in local stories, or it may have formed part of a wider visual language shared across early Neolithic communities. It may have been a sign people recognized immediately, in the same way we recognize certain symbols without needing them explained every time. The important thing is not to decode the snake too quickly, but to notice that symbols were being repeated. Repetition suggests convention. If a motif appears more than once, if it appears on objects and architecture, if it resembles motifs at neighbouring or broadly related sites, then it may have belonged to a shared repertoire. That repertoire could help bind communities together. People who use the same symbols may have recognised common stories, dangers, identities, or ritual practices. In a world without writing, images could carry knowledge across gatherings, generations, and places. They could say, "We know this sign. We belong to the people who understand it." Some of the imagery was portable, appearing on small stones or objects. That matters because portable symbols can move. A carved object can travel with a person, pass between groups, be exchanged, handled, remembered, lost, found, or placed in a building. It can carry meaning beyond the immediate settlement. Jerf el Ahmar was part of a wider world of early Neolithic communities, and similarities in imagery across the region suggest that ideas were not locked inside one village. People were moving, meeting, exchanging materials, and perhaps sharing symbolic forms. The river that gathered people may also have helped ideas move, quietly and steadily, without anyone needing to call it a communication network, which is probably for the best. The decorated communal buildings make this even more interesting because they place symbols in a shared interior. A carved object held in the hand is one thing. A decorated bench in a communal building is another. It is seen by people who enter the space. It frames where they sit and gather. It becomes part of the experience of the room. If a bench carries repeated motifs, then sitting there may place the body inside a symbolic setting. You do not only look at the decoration, you use the space shaped by it. A meeting in such a room would not feel like a meeting in an ordinary house. The building itself would remind participants that something different was happening there. This is why archaeologists often discuss these structures as non-domestic, rather than simply ritual. The term non-domestic is cautious. It says the building does not look like a normal house, but it does not force one single function onto it. A study of pre-pottery Neolithic non-domestic structures points out that such buildings have often been interpreted as ritual buildings or temples, but that there is still disagreement about how to approach and interpret them, especially because they must be understood through use, perception, and context. This caution is helpful for Jerf el Ahmar. The buildings may have been used for storage, meetings, food distribution, ritual, or several of these together. In early village life, the practical and the ritual were probably not separate boxes. They were more like ingredients in the same pot, hopefully stirred well. Think about a communal gathering around stored food. From one angle, it is economic. People are managing grain. From another angle, it is social. People are reinforcing cooperation. From another, it may be ritual. People are repeating actions in a marked building, perhaps with symbols, perhaps with rules, perhaps in relation to ancestors or seasonal events. These are not contradictory. A harvest gathering today can involve practical planning, social bonding, religious thanks, family memory, and overeating all in the same afternoon. Ancient life was not less layered than ours. It was simply layered in ways we can only partly reconstruct. The beginnings of ritual at Jerf el Ahmar were quiet because they were woven into ordinary needs. They did not require large monuments visible for miles. They did not require written prayers, carved kings, or priests in elaborate robes. They could take place in a round building sunk into the ground, on a bench marked with signs near stored grain, around a body treated in a special way, through repeated actions that told people who they were. Ritual begins when action becomes more than action, when a burial becomes memory, when a meal becomes belonging, when a symbol becomes shared knowledge, when a building becomes a place where the group recognizes itself. This may have been especially important during a time of social change. Settled life brought people close together for longer periods. As we have already seen, that created new opportunities and new tensions. People needed ways to cooperate, share, store, build, and manage risk. Ritual can help with that. Not because ritual magically removes conflict, unfortunately. If it did, every modern committee would begin with a sacred chant and finish in half the time. Ritual helps because it creates shared expectations. It tells people what to do when words alone might not be enough. It marks transitions. It gives form to grief. It makes cooperation visible. It turns a group of households into a community with common practices. The dead may have helped anchor that community. If skulls or bodies were placed in significant buildings, then the ancestors, the remembered dead, or perhaps the socially important dead were literally built into village life. This could support claims to place. It could create continuity between past and present. It could make the settlement feel older, deeper, and more legitimate with each generation. A child growing up near such buildings would not experience them as neutral structures. They would be places with stories attached. Adults may have told those stories while working, eating, entering, or avoiding certain spaces. The dead would not need to speak to be present. There is also a possible darker side. A headless body may not always mean honoured memory. It may point to violence, punishment, captivity, or conflict. We should not make early villages too peaceful simply because they were small, or because we prefer our bedtime archaeology gentle. Humans 11,000 years ago were fully human, which means capable of care, cooperation, fear, anger, rivalry, and harm. Some scholars have argued for head-taking or conflict in parts of the pre-pottery Neolithic, though others caution that the evidence is mixed and does not support one broad explanation for all skull practices. Jerf el Ahmar may have contained both the tenderness of remembrance and the reality of violence. The two are not mutually exclusive. Many societies remember the dead precisely because life is fragile and danger is real. Symbols can also hold danger. Snakes, birds, wild animals, and abstract signs may have evoked forces that were admired, feared, hunted, avoided, or mythologized. Early Neolithic imagery often features animals that were not domesticated and not simply food. Wild creatures appear in powerful ways across several sites in the region. This is interesting because it shows that while people were beginning to settle and rely more heavily on plants, their symbolic world still looked strongly toward wild animals and untamed forces. They were not turning away from the wild landscape. They were bringing its images into the village. That point is easy to miss. Jerf el Ahmar was part of the shift towards settlement, but its people still lived in close relationship with wild environments. The symbols on stones and buildings may have helped express that relationship. Snakes, birds, and other animals were not decorations in the modern sense. They may have carried stories about the land, danger, hunting, death, transformation, or group identity. A village does not become separate from nature just because it has walls. At Jerf el Ahmar, the walls may have held images of the very world outside them. The symbols may also have helped organise knowledge. The Cambridge study on Neolithic imagery suggests that repeated arrangements of images and geometric shapes on objects from sites including Jerf el Ahmar may have formed compound messages or codified visual systems rather than isolated marks. That is an important idea because it moves us away from treating early symbols as random art. These images may have been structured, they may have had rules, they may have been understood by people trained through participation, observation, and repeated handling of objects. Not writing, but not meaningless either. A system of signs can exist long before alphabets. Imagine someone holding a small engraved stone. The marks on it are familiar, but not necessarily obvious to an outsider. A snake shape, a bird form, geometric lines, perhaps a pattern repeated in a particular way. To us, it is an artifact. To them, it may have been a remembered story, a teaching object, a marker of belonging, a ritual item, a record of something, or a sign used in an exchange or ceremony. The object's meaning may have depended on who held it, where it was shown, and what was said or done around it. Symbols do not live only on surfaces, they live in use. This is one reason the quiet beginnings of ritual are so difficult to separate from teaching. Ritual often teaches without explaining everything directly. A child watches adults handle a skull, enter a building, sit on a bench, avoid a place, repeat a gesture, carve a sign, or prepare food in a certain sequence. Over time, the child learns what matters, not through a textbook, but through participation. The settlement becomes a classroom, although probably with fewer chairs and more dust. Symbols and rituals help transmit knowledge across generations because they make memory visible and repeatable. At Jerf el Ahmar, the combination of skull treatment, communal architecture, and symbolic imagery suggests that people were developing ways to hold a community together at several levels. Food held the body, buildings held the group, symbols held shared meanings, the dead held memory. None of these operated alone. They reinforced one another. The communal building with benches could host food-related activities and meetings. Its decoration could mark the space as special. A skull or headless body in such a context could connect the living group to death, identity, or power. Stored grain could make future gatherings possible. Each element gave weight to the others. This is what makes early rituals so important in the story of settlement. It was not an optional extra added after people had solved all practical problems. It may have been one of the tools for solving them. Settled life required stronger community bonds, clearer routines, shared expectations, and ways to manage stress. Ritual does that work by making social relationships feel durable. It gives people repeated forms for difficult things: death, shortage, cooperation, memory, seasonal change, and belonging. At Jerf el Ahmar, ritual may have helped people live with the new pressures created by staying put, and yet much of it would have looked ordinary from the inside. That is important. A person living there may not have divided the day into practical hours and sacred hours. Grinding grain, entering a communal building, honouring the dead, sharing food, recognising symbols, preparing for a season, all of these could belong to one continuous life. The modern separation between economy, religion, politics, and domestic routine may not fit very well. The same action could feed people, remember ancestors, reinforce authority, and mark the season. Humans like categories, but life is not always kind enough to obey them. The skulls and symbols of Jerf el Ahmar therefore do not show a finished religion in the later sense. They show something earlier and perhaps more revealing: the formation of shared practices around death, imagery, buildings, and food. They show people making meaning while also making meals. They show a community using architecture not only to shelter bodies, but to structure memory. They show that before cities, before writing, before temples in the grand later sense, people were already creating spaces where the visible and invisible sides of social life met. There is a quiet seriousness in that. Not gloomy, necessarily. Ritual is not always solemn. It can include food, laughter, movement, children watching from the side, people forgetting what they were meant to bring, and someone correcting the order of events because apparently someone always does. But it is serious because it tells people what matters. At Jerf el Ahmar, what mattered seems to have included the stored foods that supported the village, the buildings where people gathered, the dead who were treated in special ways, and the symbols that carried shared meanings across objects and walls. By looking at these signs together, the settlement becomes more than an early village beside a river. It becomes a place where humans were learning to make community durable. They were not only adapting to the environment, they were adapting to one another. They were creating ways to live with the consequences of closeness. Food had brought them into new routines, but ritual may have helped those routines become identity. The dead remained near, the symbols repeated. The building stood apart. The group gathered, not only to eat or store or work, but to recognize itself as a group. And from that point, the story begins to move into one of the most important tensions of the entire site. These people were not yet farmers in the later settled agricultural sense, but they were also no longer simply moving through the landscape in the old way. Their buildings, tools, food stores, symbols, and treatment of the dead all suggest a life pulled between mobility and permanence. They still belonged to the wild world around the Euphrates, but the village had begun to hold them with increasing strength, creating a kind of human life that stood between two eras. To call the people of Jerf el Ahmar farmers would be a little too neat. To call them wanderers would be too simple. They lived in the uncomfortable and fascinating space between those words, the sort of space where human history does most of its important work before anyone notices what is happening. Around the upper Euphrates in the early Neolithic, people were still drawing much of their food from wild landscapes. They hunted, gathered, moved through seasonal territories, recognized animal tracks, watched plants ripen, and knew the surrounding land with the close attention that survival requires. And yet, at Jerf el Ahmar, they also built houses, returned to the same place again and again, used communal buildings, stored food, processed wild cereals on a large scale, and created a settlement that does not feel like a temporary stop. The site belongs to the pre-pottery Neolithic A, and has been described as one of the important northern Levantine settlements that revealed early sedentism, communal architecture, and complex social life before the later farming world had fully appeared. That is the part that makes Jerf el Ahmar so useful for understanding the beginning of settled life. It does not let us tell a simple story. It does not say, first people wandered, then they invented farming, then they settled down, then they built villages. Instead, it shows us a community already gathering into village life, while the plants they depended on were still largely wild. That means the people were not waiting for domesticated crops before changing their own behaviour. They were changing their behaviour first. They were staying longer, building more, storing more, processing more, and depending more heavily on particular seasonal plants. Domestication, in this view, was not a light switch. It was a long relationship, and at Jerf el Ahmar we are looking at people in the middle of that relationship, perhaps not yet certain where it would lead. The phrase hunter-gatherer can sometimes mislead us, because it sounds too loose, too wandering, too temporary, as if people simply moved at random until agriculture came along to give them something serious to do. That picture is badly unfair to the intelligence of foraging societies. Mobile life can be highly organised. Seasonal movement can follow precise patterns. Food gathering can involve deep ecological knowledge, careful timing, storage, processing, and social rules. A person who knows when wild barley is ready, where gazelles move, which plants can be eaten, which stones make good tools, when the river is dangerous, where water remains in dry periods, and how to read weather from small signs is not living casually. They are living expertly. Most of us, set down in such a landscape without a phone, a road, or a snack in our pocket, would become philosophical for about 10 minutes and then quite worried. So when we say the people of Jerf el Ahmar were no longer simply wanderers, we do not mean they had graduated from a lesser way of life. We mean their relationship with place had changed. They were still people of the landscape, but one place along that landscape had become unusually important. The riverbank settlement held buildings, tools, storage, memories, and perhaps ancestors. It became a point of return. Movement did not vanish, but it now circled around a more stable centre. That is a subtle change, but a very powerful one. A group can still travel, hunt, gather, visit, exchange, and move seasonally while also maintaining a settlement that anchors part of its identity. Life does not have to be either fully mobile or fully settled. In the early Neolithic, it was often both. Jerf el Ahmar seems to sit exactly in that mixed condition. The people there were using wild cereals intensively, and researchers have argued that at the site barley was harvested and processed roughly 1,000 years before its domestication, with rows of querns showing systematic food production from wild grain. This is a very important clue, because it shows a community whose daily work already resembles later agricultural life in some ways, even though the plants themselves had not yet become the familiar domestic crops of later farming villages. The grain was wild, but the human routine around it was becoming more settled. It is as if the people had not yet crossed the threshold into farming, but they were already spending a great deal of time standing in the doorway, rearranging the furniture. That doorway matters because the difference between wild gathering and farming is not as simple as people once imagined. Wild cereals can be gathered from natural stands. They can also be encouraged, protected, harvested repeatedly, or perhaps sown in favourable places before full domestication appears in the plant remains. Archaeobotanists look for clues such as grain size, weed species, plant distribution, and the presence of cereals outside their natural habitats when thinking about pre-domestic cultivation. Evidence for cultivation of wild cereals has been identified at Jerf el Ahmar, including wild barley and two-grained incorn, though exactly how these practices developed remains part of a larger archaeological debate. The important point for our quiet journey is that people were not simply picking up whatever nature happened to offer. They were interacting with plants in repeated, structured, increasingly committed ways. Imagine a season when the grain ripens. People know the timing. They know the places where stands are good. They know how long the window lasts before seeds scatter. Perhaps they go out in groups, carrying baskets, tools, and the kind of practical patience that does not make it into heroic legends, but keeps everyone fed. They harvest. They return. The grain is not eaten immediately in the field. It comes back to the settlement, to the place where grinding stones wait. There, the raw plants become food through labour. This return journey from field or wild stand to village is not just a path through space. It is a sign of the settlement's growing role. The food belongs to the landscape, but it becomes edible in the village. And that is where staying put begins to feel less like a choice made once, and more like a habit reinforced every season. If tools remain in the settlement, if buildings protect stores, if communal spaces organise work, if people expect to process grain there, then the village becomes necessary. You may still travel outward, but you come back because coming back is how the system works. This is not farming yet in the full later sense, but it is not simple wandering either. It is a tethered life, tied by grain, stone, storage, memory, and social expectation. The people themselves may not have thought of this as a transformation. They probably did not sit around discussing whether their subsistence strategy placed them between mobile foraging and agricultural sedentism. That sounds like the sort of phrase that would make even a very patient Neolithic listener stare into the fire until it was over. They were solving immediate problems. How much food can be gathered this season? Where should it be processed? How can it be kept dry? How long will it last? Who will help build or repair the storage place? What happens if another group arrives? What happens if the harvest is poor? What happens if the river changes? They lived through practical decisions, not historical categories. But over generations, practical decisions become a way of life. This is why the transition matters so much. People did not become farmers overnight. They became more attached to certain foods, more attached to certain places, and more organised around certain forms of labour. Wild cereals were not only eaten, they were scheduled, they were stored, they were ground in buildings, they demanded cooperation. They may have changed how people divided work across households and seasons. Once a plant shapes your calendar, your architecture, your tools, and your social life, it has already become much more than a wild resource, even before biology calls it domesticated. The same is true of the settlement itself. A camp can be left behind with little regret if it is designed for short use. A village is different. A village accumulates effort. Walls take labour. Floors take repair. Storage takes protection. Communal buildings take coordination. If you abandon such a place, you are not just moving away from a patch of ground. You're walking away from stored work. That is why the people of Jerf el Ahmar were no longer wanderers in the simplest sense. Their labour was becoming fixed in place. Once labour is fixed, memory follows. Once memory follows, identity begins to settle too. This does not mean they never moved. It is very likely that movement remained part of life. Hunting parties would have gone out. Plant gathering would have required seasonal travel. People may have visited other groups, exchanged materials, found partners, attended gatherings, or moved through the landscape for reasons we cannot see archaeologically. Obsidian found at Jerf el Ahmar has been studied for its source, which shows that materials from outside the immediate settlement world were reaching the site through wider networks of movement and exchange. The village was not a sealed bubble, it was connected. People and objects still travelled. The difference is that travel now linked back to a more established home place. A settled or semi-settled life also changes how people understand possessions. In a highly mobile lifestyle, objects must justify being carried. Weight matters. A person does not casually carry around several large grinding slabs unless they enjoy suffering or have made unusual life choices. But in a village, heavy things can stay. This allows new technologies and new routines to become practical. Large querns, storage bins, fixed hearths, benches, and more substantial architecture all become possible because the place itself carries weight for the community. The settlement becomes a kind of shared backpack, thankfully one that no one has to lift. This changes households too. When people settle more deeply, houses become more than sleeping shelters. They become places where equipment accumulates, where food is prepared, where family histories are lived out, where children learn routines, and where social differences may begin to appear. At Jerf el Ahmar, researchers have noted a distinction between individual houses and buildings for group use, showing that domestic and communal life were being organised in different kinds of architectural space. That difference matters because it means the community was not only a collection of families, it had spaces where the group acted beyond the household. The people were becoming villagers, not simply because they had houses, but because their lives were arranged through a relationship between households and shared institutions. The word institution may sound far too official for Jerf el Ahmar. It brings to mind paperwork, corridors, and a person behind a desk who needs you to come back with the correct form. But an institution can be much simpler than that. It is a repeated way of doing something together. A communal storage building can be an institution. A seasonal gathering can be an institution. A shared rule about grain can be an institution. A burial practice can be an institution. The people of Jerf el Ahmar had no writing, no bureaucracy, and no state, but they seem to have had repeated shared practices built into their architecture and food systems. That is early social complexity in a very human form. The difference between not yet farmers and no longer wanderers also appears in the way risk was managed. Mobile foragers can respond to shortages by moving toward other resources, although that depends on territory, climate, social relationships, and many other factors. More settled communities manage risk partly through storage. Grain and legumes, if kept properly, can help carry people through lean times, but storage creates its own vulnerabilities. Stored food can spoil, be stolen, attract pests, or become the focus of conflict. Staying in one place can make some things easier and others harder. It is never simply progress in a straight line, it is a trade. More security in one area, more pressure in another. More food stored for the future, more need to protect it. More people nearby to help, more people nearby to annoy you. That last point is not trivial. Living closer together changes social life. People must negotiate space, noise, waste, food access, labour, and responsibility. In a small mobile group, tensions may be managed by movement or flexible association. In a village, everyone is still there in the morning. That creates the need for stronger habits of cooperation. Food sharing, rituals, communal buildings, and symbolic practices may all have helped manage the social pressure of increasing settlement. The people of Jerf el Ahmar were not only learning how to stay near grain, they were learning how to stay near one another. Children would have experienced this changing world differently from adults. For someone born into Jerf el Ahmar, the settlement may not have felt experimental. It may have felt normal. Houses, grinding stones, communal buildings, stored grain, river paths, carved symbols, and familiar gathering places would have formed the background of childhood. The older generation may have remembered different movement patterns or other places more strongly. Younger people may have grown up with deeper attachment to the village. This is one of the quiet ways history changes, not because everyone changes their mind at once, but because children are born into new habits and treat them as ordinary. The people were not yet farmers because domesticated crops and the later agricultural package had not fully arrived. They were no longer wanderers because their lives were increasingly anchored in a built settlement, fixed tools, stored foods, and communal spaces. That middle condition is not a weakness in the story, it is the story. Jerf el Ahmar matters precisely because it shows a community before the familiar categories have hardened. If we look only for farmers, we miss what came before farming. If we look only for hunter-gatherers, we miss how complex and settled some foraging communities could become. The site teaches us to look at the process rather than only the result. A useful comparison is the way a path forms. No one needs to design it formally. People walk the same route because it is useful. Then others follow. The ground becomes slightly clearer. More people use it because it is now easier to see. Over time, the path becomes a feature of the landscape. Early farming may have developed in a similar way. People returned to useful plants. They harvested them repeatedly. They carried them back to settlements. They processed and stored them. They may have scattered seeds, disturbed soils, and favoured certain traits without intending to transform plant evolution. Each act was small. Together they formed a path. Jerf el Ahmar is one of the places where we can still see part of that path pressed into the ground. The emotional side of this shift is harder to see, but it would have mattered. Staying creates attachment. A place with houses, stored food, familiar paths, communal buildings, and the dead nearby is not just useful. It can become beloved, feared, contested, remembered, and defended. People may have felt pride in the buildings they helped make. They may have felt obligation to return for seasonal work or gatherings. They may have associated certain spaces with relatives, meals, stories, or events. The settlement may have become part of how they understood themselves. This does not require modern ideas of property or homeland. It only requires memory tied to place. There may also have been a sense of tension. The wild landscape still mattered. Hunting and gathering still pulled people outward. The village pulled them back. That push and pull is central to this stage of human life. The people of Jerf el Ahmar were not enclosed behind city walls. They were river people, plant people, hunters, gatherers. builders, storers, symbol makers, and perhaps early cultivators, depending on how we interpret the evidence. Their world was not divided between nature and culture as neatly as ours often pretends to be. The village was part of the landscape. The landscape came into the village through grain, wood, stone, animals, symbols, stories, and bodies. That is why it would be wrong to imagine settlement as a retreat from the wild. At Jerf el Ahmar, settlement seems more like a new way of organising the wild. Wild grain was brought in and processed. Wild animals appeared in imagery. Stone and wood became architecture. Seasonal abundance became storage. The river remained central. The people did not leave the natural world behind. They created a more stable human centre within it. Farming, when it later developed more fully, would deepen that transformation. But the first step was not domination. It was a repeated relationship. There is a humility in recognising this. Modern people often imagine agriculture as the moment humans took control. But the early stages probably felt less like control and more like negotiation. Plants had their own timing. Weather had its own moods. Rivers had their own habits. Animals moved where they wished. People could plan, but they could not command the world. They could only learn its patterns, work with them, and gradually shape them through repeated action. The people of Jerf el Ahmar were clever not because they conquered nature, but because they paid close enough attention to make staying possible. And staying possible is not the same as staying easy. Grain processing was hard, building was hard, storage was hard, social coordination was hard. The early village was not a soft landing after a difficult mobile life. It was a different kind of difficulty. More routines, more labour in one place, more dependence on seasonal success, more responsibility to others. It may have brought comfort, but also pressure. We should not imagine the Neolithic transition as a simple improvement in daily life. It was a transformation, and transformations are rarely polite. Still, the fact that people continued returning to Jerf el Ahmar tells us that the balance must often have been worth it. The settlement offered something strong enough to hold them. Food security, social belonging, access to the river, storage, workspaces, ritual places, memory and connection all likely played roles. No single reason explains the gathering. Instead, many small reasons reinforced each other until the village became a centre of life. This is how human societies often change, not by one cause but by many causes leaning in the same direction. If we stand back, the people of Jerf el Ahmar look like makers of a threshold. Behind them lay hundreds of thousands of years of human skill in mobile hunting and gathering. Ahead lay the long and uneven rise of farming villages, towns, cities, states, writing, and all the complex machinery of later civilization. But they were not simply between past and future. They were living their own present, with its own logic. Their lives were not incomplete because they were not yet farmers. They were not backward because they still gathered wild resources. They were people solving the problems of their own world with intelligence, cooperation and experiment. That may be the most important thing to remember. Jerf el Ahmar does not show humans becoming human. They already were. It shows humans changing the structure of daily life. The shift was not in intelligence but in arrangement. Food arranged differently, labour arranged differently, space arranged differently, memory arranged differently. The same human capacities that once supported mobile life were now being used to build a village that could hold people, grain, tools, symbols, and the dead in one place for longer than before. The people who were not yet farmers but no longer wanderers lived with 1 foot in movement and 1 foot in settlement. They could read the land and repair a wall. They could gather wild plants and process them in fixed buildings. They could hunt beyond the village and return to stored food. They could live with the river's seasonal changes and still build as if the place would matter next year. That combination is what makes them so compelling. They show us that the road to farming was not a clean break from the foraging past. It was a braided path made from old knowledge and new commitments. And then, after all that work, all that building, All that grain ground between stones, all those gatherings in round, sunken rooms. Jerf el Ahmar itself did what human places often do. It changed, was abandoned, buried, rediscovered, recorded, and finally covered by modern reservoir waters after the construction of the Tishrin Dam. The people who lived there could not have imagined that ending. They knew the river as a living force beside them, not as the thing that would one day cover the ruins of their village. Yet the evidence they left was strong enough to keep speaking, even from beneath water, about a time when humans were learning how to stay without yet becoming the farmers their descendants would be. Jerf el Ahmar is quiet now, in a way it never was when people lived there. Not quiet like an abandoned house standing in the sun, with wind moving through broken walls and dust collecting on floors. Quieter than that. The site lies beneath the waters of the Tishrin Dam reservoir, after rescue excavations in the 1990s recorded as much as possible before flooding ended the fieldwork in 1999. The excavations, directed by Daniel Stodeur and co-directed by Bassem Jamous, revealed the kind of evidence that made archaeologists rethink early Neolithic architecture, plant use, and the transition towards settled village life. So when we speak of Jerf el Ahmar now, we're speaking of a place that has vanished from ordinary sight, but not from knowledge. Its walls, tools, seeds, bones, benches and plans were taken into record before the water covered the ground, and those records are what allow the village to keep speaking. There is something fitting about that, though not in a neat or cheerful way. A settlement drawn to the river was eventually hidden by a modern river project. The Euphrates helped gather people there around 11,000 years ago, and thousands of years later, the wider human management of that same river system covered the remains. The people of Jerf el Ahmar knew the river as water, root, risk, resource, and presence. They could not have imagined dams, reservoirs, salvage archaeology, or researchers debating their buildings in journals and books. They could not have imagined that one day their village would be studied not by walking through its living spaces, but by drawings, photographs, samples, excavation notes, reconstructions, and careful comparisons with other early Neolithic sites. That is how deep time often works. The past does not disappear all at once, it changes the way it can be reached. If Jerf el Ahmar whispers from beneath the water, what it says first is that human life changed slowly. Not passively, not accidentally, but slowly. The old story of the Neolithic as a single invention of farming followed by villages is much too tidy. At Jerf el Ahmar we see people already living in a village-like settlement, while still working with wild plants, wild animals, river landscapes, and inherited foraging knowledge. The site belongs to the pre-pottery Neolithic A, and its remains were spread across 2 hills on the bank of the Middle Euphrates, with successive occupation levels and an architectural sequence that included curving buildings, later rectangular plans, and several communal structures. This was not a simple campsite. It was a place of return, construction, repair, gathering, storage, and memory. That is one of the most important lessons the site gives us. Humans did not suddenly become settled because someone discovered a seed could be planted. They became more settled because many parts of life began to pull in the same direction. The river offered resources and roots. Wild cereals and legumes offered foods that could be processed and stored. Heavy grinding stones encouraged return. Houses made the place useful. Communal buildings made the group more organized. Burials and symbols made the settlement meaningful. Each of these things strengthened the others. None alone explains everything. Together they show a community forming a new relationship with place. A village like Jerf el Ahmar does not look dramatic if we expect history to announce itself with monuments. There were no pyramids, no writing, no royal tombs, no bronze weapons, no city walls, no taxes, and no one trying to find the correct department for a building permit. But that is part of its importance. The settlement shows that large historical changes begin through ordinary routines. Food gathered at the right season, grain carried back, stones used again and again, houses repaired, a communal room entered, A body placed in a meaningful context, a symbol carved, a building rebuilt, a child learning where things belong. These are small acts from the inside, but over generations they become a new form of life. The water over the site makes those small acts feel more fragile. Archaeology often depends on a lucky pause between loss and disappearance. Jerf el Ahmar was excavated because the reservoir threatened to flood it. Without that rescue work, much of what we now know would have been covered before it could be understood. The first publications on the site were brief, but they already made clear that it would become one of the key early Neolithic sites, and later work drew together evidence from many occupation levels, dozens of houses and several communal buildings. That means our view of the village is both rich and incomplete. Rich because the excavation revealed remarkable architecture and botanical evidence. Incomplete because no excavation can recover everything, especially under time pressure. The past always keeps some of its rooms closed. Still, the evidence is enough to change the shape of the story. Jerf el Ahmar shows that early settled communities were not simply practical responses to food supply. They were social worlds. The communal buildings especially make this clear. Some were partly or fully dug into the ground, larger than ordinary houses, fitted with benches or internal divisions, and placed in ways that suggest they mattered to more than one household. Their presence does not let us label everything with certainty, but it does tell us that shared life had become architectural. People built spaces where the group could gather, store, work, remember, or mark events. The settlement was not only a cluster of homes, it had a centre, or perhaps several centres over time, where community life took material form. That is a quiet but enormous development. A community becomes different when it builds for itself as a community. A house says a household needs shelter. A communal structure says a group needs a place to act together. That action might involve food storage, meetings, ritual, distribution, or all of these mixed together in ways that do not fit modern categories. We should not imagine a sharp line between the practical and the symbolic. At Jerf el Ahmar, grain, benches, skulls, decorations and architecture seemed to belong to a world where everyday survival and shared meaning were closely intertwined. A building could store food and carry memory. A meal could feed bodies and reinforce belonging. A skull could be a human remain and a social presence. A symbol could be a mark on stone and a reminder of stories we can no longer hear. The village also whispers that farming was not just a technical invention, it was a social transformation. Wild grain had to become part of a whole way of life before domesticated grain could dominate later landscapes. Processing cereals on a large scale required time, tools, repeated labour, and places where that labour could happen. Storage required trust and planning. Return required memory. Once people were already living with those habits, the biological domestication of plants was only one part of a larger change. The plants changed over generations, but so did people. Bodies changed through labour. Schedules changed through harvests. Buildings changed through storage. Relationships changed through sharing and access. The future changed because people began to prepare for it in one place. That may be one of the most human things about Jerf el Ahmar. It shows people learning to trust the future just enough to build for it. Not with certainty. They could not control weather, harvests, sickness, conflict, or the river. They did not have the later confidence of agricultural systems, and even those systems are never as secure as people hope. But they trusted enough to repair flaws, install heavy tools, make storage spaces, and return to the same settlement. They trusted enough to let the place gather their work. A village is partly made of that trust. Not blind trust, but practical trust. The belief that it is worth putting effort here because here will matter again. At the same time, Jerf el Ahmar warns us not to make the Neolithic too comfortable. Settling down did not simply make life easier, it changed the difficulties. More grain meant more grinding. More storage meant more protection. More buildings meant more maintenance. More people in one place meant more cooperation. but also more tension. Shared food could create belonging, but also questions of access. Ritual could hold people together, but it could also mark power, obligation, exclusion, or fear. The early village was not a peaceful postcard from the dawn of civilization. It was a working solution to real problems, and like all human solutions, it created new problems of its own. That is another thing the site tells us from beneath the water. Early communities were already complex because humans are complex. Complexity did not begin with cities. It did not wait for writing. It did not require kings. It appeared whenever people had to coordinate food, labour, memory, movement, and belonging across time. Jerf el Ahmar had no state, but it had organisation. It had no written records, but it had repeated architecture. It had no formal granaries in the later urban sense, but it had storage and processing systems. It had no temples that we can name with certainty, but it had special buildings and symbols that likely mattered to the group. If we reserve the word complex only for societies with palaces and scribes, we miss the quieter complexity that made those later worlds possible. The site also changes how we think about civilization, though that word should be handled gently. Civilization is often imagined as a tower rising upward, with hunter-gatherers at the bottom, farmers above them, cities higher still, and modern people standing at the top pretending not to be tired. Jerf el Ahmar gives us a better image, a web of relationships becoming denser, people and plants, people and rivers, people and buildings, people and the dead, people and symbols, people and future seasons. None of these relationships alone makes a city. But as they thicken, they make new forms of life possible. The later world of agriculture did not rise from nothing. It grew from these entanglements. There is also a lesson in humility. The people of Jerf el Ahmar lived without almost everything we now think of as normal. No metal tools, no pottery in the later common sense, no writing, no wheels, no domesticated herd animals in the later village economy, no maps, no clocks, no supermarkets, no weather forecasts, and no one on the internet explaining that they were doing the Neolithic incorrectly. Yet they built planned structures, organised labour, processed wild cereals intensively, maintained social spaces, and developed symbolic practices. They were not waiting for intelligence to arrive. They were using intelligence in ways suited to their world. The difference between them and us is not mental capacity. It is circumstance, technology, and history. That matters because deep prehistory is often treated as distant in a way that makes people seem less real. 11,000 years is a long time. It is long enough for languages to vanish completely, for landscapes to change, for bodies to become archaeological remains, for villages to become layers, and for rivers to shift their course. But the daily concerns are still understandable. Food, shelter, work, children, illness, weather, death, sharing, memory, the frustration of tools, the comfort of familiar routines, the uncertainty of next season, the need to belong somewhere. These are not modern inventions. Jerf el Ahmar feels distant because its world was materially different, but it feels close because its problems were human. The water above the site also reminds us that archaeology is not only about ancient loss, it is about modern choices. Dams bring electricity, irrigation, political decisions, engineering, and human needs of another age. They also flood landscapes that hold older human stories. Rescue archaeology exists in that difficult space, trying to record what can be recorded before change arrives. Jerf el Ahmar survived as knowledge because archaeologists, local workers, specialists, and institutions acted before the reservoir closed over it. But the submerged site is a reminder that heritage is vulnerable, not only to war, looting, or neglect, but also to the ordinary projects by which modern societies reshape rivers, valleys, and land. And yet there is no need to turn the ending only into sadness. The site is underwater, but it is not silent. In a way, Jerf el Ahmar has become more widely heard after its disappearance than it ever could have been as an unexcavated mound by the river. Its plans, samples and publications now speak to archaeologists, students, and anyone curious about how settled life began. The village has gone from view, but it remains part of the conversation about the Neolithic, about agriculture, about communal architecture, and about the strange threshold where humans were no longer simply moving through landscapes, but beginning to build places that could hold them. If we gather the whole journey together gently, the answer to why humans were gathering there 11,000 years ago is not a single sentence. They gathered because the Euphrates made the land generous and readable. They gathered because wild cereals and other foods could be harvested, processed and stored. They gathered because heavy tools and buildings made return worthwhile. They gathered because living together helped manage risk. They gathered because shared spaces gave the community a body. They gathered because the dead, the symbols, the meals and the memories made the place matter. They gathered because at Jerf el Ahmar, usefulness and meaning had begun to settle into the same ground. That is the whisper beneath the water. Not a secret code, not a lost civilization in the dramatic sense, not a mystery that needs one grand solution. It is a quieter message. Human history often turns on places where ordinary people repeat useful acts until the world changes around them. A riverbank becomes a settlement. A wild grain becomes a stored food. A grinding stone becomes a reason to return. A room becomes a communal building. A burial becomes memory in the ground. A symbol becomes shared recognition. A group becomes a village. And now here we are, far downstream in time, listening from homes, rooms, cities, and quiet places of our own. We still gather around food. We still build special rooms for shared life. We still mark our dead. We still attach memory to place. We still rely on rivers, even when we hide them under bridges, dams, pipes and maps. The world has changed almost beyond recognition, but the human habit of making meaning out of survival has not gone away. Jerf el Ahmar matters because it shows that habit near one of its early turning points, before the great cities, before written history, before agriculture had fully remade the land. So perhaps, as the story settles, the village beneath the water asks a final gentle question. What makes a place worth returning to? Is it food, safety, people, memory, work, or the small comfort of knowing where things belong? For the people of Jerf el Ahmar, the answer was probably all of these at once. They returned because life there worked well enough, mattered deeply enough, and held together strongly enough to bring them back season after season. And from those returns came traces that still reach us, even through silt, water, and 11,000 years. If you have drifted with this old river all the way to the end, then perhaps you're now a little farther along your own evening too. The people of Jerf el Ahmar had their river, their grain, their buildings, their gatherings, and their uncertain futures. We have our screens, our rooms, our schedules, our questions, and our own ways of staying connected. The distance between us is enormous but not empty. It is crossed by the simple fact that humans have always looked for places to gather, reasons to remain, and ways to carry the past into tomorrow. And so, from the red cliff beneath the reservoir, from the village that appeared for a moment in excavation and then slipped below the water again, the story leaves us with something plain and steady. Before cities, people were already building community. Before farming was complete, people were already changing the land and being changed by it. Before history was written, people were already leaving records in stone, seed, bone, and floor. Jerf el Ahmar does not shout. It does not need to. It rests below the water and keeps its old evidence quietly, reminding us that the beginning of settled life was not a sudden invention, but a long human gathering beside a river. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever you are listening from tonight,